The champagne glass trembled in my hand as my mother's voice cut through the Ritz-Carlton ballroom like a blade. "Look at Emily, everyone!" Margaret announced into the microphone, her perfectly manicured finger pointing directly at me. 38 years old and still sitting alone. What a disappointment. The entire wedding reception, 200 of Dallas's elite, turned to stare. My sister Sarah beamed in her Vera Wang gown, while her new husband Mark smirked from the head table. The familiar ache of being the family scapegoat threatened to crush me just like it had for decades. But tonight was different. Tonight the woman they'd dismissed as a failure was about to shatter every assumption they'd ever made. I stood slowly smoothing my vintage dress, the same one they'd mocked me for wearing. "You keep asking about my husband, Mother," I said, my voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "Funny thing is, you've already met him." Margaret's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Oh, please, Emily, your little fantasies won't—" The thunderous roar of helicopter blades cut her off mid-sentence. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, guests watched in stunned silence as a Sikorsky S-76 descended onto the hotel's VIP landing pad. My phone buzzed with a text, "On my way up, Mrs. Alcott." Mrs. Alcott. Not the single failure they thought they knew. What happened next would expose secrets that went back generations, reveal betrayals that would destroy reputations, and prove that the quiet daughter they'd underestimated had been playing a completely different game all along. The war was about to begin. My name is Emily Hargrove, and at 38, I've become an expert at being invisible. I work as a freelance financial consultant from my modest home in the Dallas suburbs, a career that allows me the flexibility to live life on my own terms. Most people see a woman who never quite measured up to her family's expectations, but they have no idea how wrong they are. I sat in my kitchen this morning, the familiar weight of inadequacy settling over me like an old worn blanket. The wooden table where I'd eaten countless solitary breakfasts held my leather-bound diary, its pages filled with decades of careful observations about my family's peculiar brand of cruelty. The morning light streaming through the gingham curtains felt too bright, too cheerful for the darkness of my thoughts. My phone buzzed against the granite countertop, and I didn't need to look to know who was calling. Margaret Hargrove's ringtone had become the soundtrack to my self-doubt. "Emily, darling." My mother's voice dripped with the kind of false sweetness that preceded criticism. "I was just talking to Linda Morrison at the club yesterday, and she mentioned how lovely it must be for Sarah to have such a devoted older sister." Of course, I had to remind her that devotion is wonderful, but a woman's true value comes from the man she manages to catch and keep. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles going white. "Good morning to you too, Mother." "Don't take that tone with me. I'm simply pointing out that Sarah has always understood what it means to be a Hargrove woman. She's the pride of our lineage, you know, beautiful, accomplished, and now marrying into the Preston family. Meanwhile, you're—" She paused, and I could practically hear her searching for a diplomatic way to express her disappointment. "Well, you're still finding yourself, aren't you?" The words stung because they were designed to. Margaret had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment, the gentle criticism that left you questioning your worth long after the conversation ended. I'd been on the receiving end of these calls for years, each one a reminder that I was the daughter who'd failed to live up to the Hargrove name. "Sarah has always been special," I agreed quietly, watching the steam rise from my untouched coffee. It was easier to agree than to fight, and besides, Sarah truly was remarkable, just not in the ways our mother celebrated. Exactly. She understands that in our circles, a woman is only as good as the family she marries into. The country club ladies all admire how she's landed Mark Preston. His family has been members for 3 generations. I opened my diary to a page I'd written just last week after attending one of our family's monthly barbecues. The entry read, "Watched Uncle Robert's wife pat Sarah's arm while shooting pitying glances my way." "Still no ring, sweetie?" she asked, as if my worth could be measured by the weight of jewelry on my left hand. I wanted to laugh. If only they knew. That barbecue had been particularly brutal. I'd sat at the picnic table in my parents' backyard watching relatives fawn over Sarah's engagement ring while treating me like a piece of furniture they'd forgotten to replace. The conversation swirled around me but rarely included me. I was the spare daughter, the one who made everyone else feel better about their choices by serving as a cautionary tale. "Are you listening to me, Emily?" Margaret's voice cut through my reverie. "Of course, Mother. I was saying that it's not too late for you, darling. There are still some decent men in their 50s looking for companionship. Nothing wrong with being someone's second wife, especially at your age." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. In my diary, I'd written countless responses to comments like these, but I'd never voiced them. I smiled politely at Mother's words. I'd penned just days ago. But inside, I've been a mother for years. And a wife, though they don't deserve to know. "I'll keep that in mind," I said instead. After ending the call, I turned to an earlier entry in my diary, one that always puzzled me. Mother hides something about grandfather and those old land deals. I'd written months ago after overhearing a hushed phone conversation. There were secrets in our family layers of history that Margaret kept carefully buried beneath the country club propriety and social climbing. But those mysteries seemed less important than the daily reality of being dismissed and diminished. The afternoon mail brought Sarah's wedding invitation, thick cardstock with elegant script that screamed expensive taste. But it was the handwritten note paperclipped to the back that made my stomach clench. In Margaret's precise penmanship, "Come if you want, but don't embarrass the family at the country club." I read those words 3 times, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation rise in my chest. 38 years of this treatment. 38 years of being made to feel like an obligation rather than a daughter. I gripped the invitation so tightly that my fingers left impressions in the expensive paper. But something shifted in that moment, a quiet resolve crystallizing in my chest. I looked up from the invitation and caught my reflection in the kitchen window, seeing not the family disappointment they'd created, but the woman I'd become despite them. "This time," I whispered to my reflection, my voice steady with newfound determination, "you'll see who I really am." The wedding invitation still lay on my kitchen table 3 days later when Margaret called again, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for conversations about family obligations and social expectations. "Emily, I want to be perfectly clear about Saturday," she began without preamble. "You're coming just to maintain appearances for Sarah at the Ritz-Carlton. This is her day, her moment to shine in front of Dallas society, and I won't have any drama or attention-seeking behavior. Don't expect to be treated like the VIP guests. You're simply not that type of person, and everyone understands that." I stirred my morning coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into patterns that reminded me of storm clouds. "I understand, Mother." "Good. The Preston family has very high standards, and their friends from the country club will be watching everything. Sarah has worked so hard to build the right connections, and I won't see that undermined by any of your usual awkwardness." The casual cruelty in her voice was nothing new, but it still had the power to make my chest tighten. After she hung up, I sat in the silence of my kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary details of my carefully constructed life. The ceramic rooster collection on the windowsill, the magnetic poetry words scattered across my refrigerator, the stack of financial planning magazines I read religiously, all evidence of a woman who existed, who had interests and expertise, even if her family refused to acknowledge it. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, and I opened it to find a series of glamorous photos. She stood in what was clearly an upscale bridal boutique, posed in a stunning ivory gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. The dress hugged her figure perfectly, its intricate beadwork catching the light like captured starlight. "Final dress fitting today," the message read. "So excited, BTW, I was thinking about what you should wear. Remember that old prom dress from when I was still a teenager? The blue one with the sequins? You should totally wear that. It's vintage now, which is so trendy, and it's economical too. Perfect for your thrift store lifestyle. Plus, it would be like a fun throwback for everyone who remembers." I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the familiar sting of Sarah's particular brand of thoughtless cruelty. She had a gift for packaging insults as helpful suggestions for making her contempt sound like sisterly concern. The dress she was referring to hung in the back of my closet, a relic from my junior year of high school, when I'd been so proud to wear something beautiful to prom, even if it was a hand-me-down from our cousin. That afternoon, I pulled the dress from its plastic garment bag and held it up to the light. The royal blue fabric had faded slightly, and a few sequins had come loose over the years, but it was still beautiful in its way. I slipped it on and stood before my bedroom mirror, and suddenly, I was 17 again, standing in this same spot while Margaret fussed over the fit. "It's perfectly adequate," she'd said, then the same tone she used now when discussing my life choices. "Sarah will look stunning in her new dress, of course, but you'll make a nice companion. Just remember, this is her night. You're there to support her, not to draw attention to yourself." I remembered how those words had stung, how I'd spent that entire prom feeling like an understudy in someone else's life. Sarah had been only 14 then, but she'd already mastered the art of making me feel invisible. She'd critiqued my hair, suggested I was wearing too much makeup, and made sure everyone knew the dress was a cast-off. Standing in that same dress now, I felt the weight of all those accumulated humiliations. Every family gathering where I'd been treated like furniture, every phone call where my accomplishments were dismissed, every moment when I'd been made to feel less than. But something else stirred too. Something that had been growing stronger over the years of forced silence and swallowed pride. I sat at my small writing desk and opened my diary to a fresh page. "They think I'm weak because I don't argue," I wrote carefully. "They mistake my silence for submission, my discretion for defeat. But silence is the weapon I've sharpened through lonely nights with Rose, through years of watching and learning and building something they can't even imagine." Later that evening, Sarah sent another text, this one containing an old family photo from that long-ago prom night. I studied the image on my phone screen, seeing my teenage self standing awkwardly beside a radiant Sarah who'd insisted on being in the photo despite not attending the dance. Something about Sarah's appearance in the picture struck me as odd. Her eyes seemed different somehow, shaped in a way that didn't quite match the rest of her features, almost as if she resembled someone else entirely. For a moment, I wondered if I was seeing things that weren't there, letting old jealousies color my perception. I shook my head and dismissed the thought. Jealousy had always been my weakness when it came to Sarah, and I wouldn't let it cloud my judgment now. The dress still fit perfectly, I realized as I took one last look in the mirror. But I wasn't the same woman who'd worn it all those years ago. That girl had believed her family's assessment of her worth. This woman knew better. I walked to my dresser and looked at the small, locked wooden box that sat in the corner, partially hidden behind a framed photo of a sunset. For years I'd told myself I was protecting the secrets inside, keeping them safe, until the right moment. But perhaps I'd really been protecting myself, hiding behind the safety of anonymity and low expectations. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the brass key I kept hidden in my jewelry box. It was time to stop being the family failure, time to end this charade once and for all. The lock clicked open and I lifted the lid with fingers that shook with anticipation rather than fear. Inside the wooden box lay the most precious documents of my real life. A marriage certificate dated 5 years ago bearing the names Emily Catherine Hargrove and Richard James Alcott. Beneath it, Rose's birth certificate and a collection of photographs that told the story my family had never been allowed to see. I lifted the marriage certificate with reverent hands, remembering the quiet ceremony at the Dallas courthouse, where Richard and I had exchanged vows with only a judge and 2 witnesses present. No country club reception, no society photographers, no Margaret orchestrating every detail to reflect well on the Hargrove name. Just 2 people who had found something real in a world that often felt hollow. The sound of small feet pattering down the hallway interrupted my reverie, and I quickly closed the box as Rose burst into my bedroom. At 4 years old, she was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, her dark curls bouncing as she launched herself onto my bed with the fearlessness that only children possess. "Mama, Daddy's on the computer wanting to talk to you," she announced, her bright smile lighting up the room in a way that never failed to make my heart swell. Those same dark curls that I'd run my fingers through during countless bedtime stories. The same infectious laugh that had filled our home with joy from the moment she'd taken her first breath. I followed Rose to the small office where my laptop sat open on the desk, Richard's familiar face filling the screen from his hotel room in New York. Even through the pixelated video connection, his presence brought me the same sense of calm and belonging that I'd felt since the day we met 6 years ago at a community church barbecue in North Dallas. "There are my two favorite girls," Richard said, his voice warm with the affection that had anchored me through every storm my family had created. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had built something meaningful from nothing. But when he looked at Rose and me, his eyes held the same tenderness they'd shown that first evening when he'd offered me a plate of grilled vegetables from the church garden. "Daddy Mama's trying on old dresses," Rose informed him with the matter-of-fact honesty of childhood climbing onto my lap as I settled into the desk chair. Richard's eyebrows raised in amusement. "Oh, really special occasion. Sarah's wedding is tomorrow," I explained, smoothing Rose's curls. "The family command performance." I watched Richard's expression shift slightly, the way it always did when my family entered our conversations. He understood the weight of their judgment, the years of conditioning that had taught me to expect disappointment rather than support. But he also understood something else, that tomorrow would be different. "This time, no more hiding," I said softly, meeting his eyes through the screen. "They'll see us as a real family, not Sarah's shadow." Richard nodded, his businessman's mind already working through logistics. "The helicopter will pick me up at LaGuardia at 3. I'll be at the hotel by 8, just like we planned." Rose giggled at the mention of the helicopter, having ridden in it only twice before, when Richard had surprised us with weekend trips to his properties in Austin. To her, it was simply another way Daddy traveled for work, not the symbol of wealth and power that would shock the Ritz-Carlton wedding guests into silence. "Tell me again about the vegetables, Daddy," Rose requested, settling more comfortably in my lap. It was her favorite story, one Richard had told her dozens of times about the night we met. "Well, little bird," Richard began, using his pet name for her, "I was cooking for the whole church that night using tomatoes and peppers and herbs that the congregation had grown in their community garden. Your mama was sitting by herself at one of the picnic tables looking like she needed a friend." I remembered that evening with perfect clarity. I'd been feeling particularly raw after another phone call from Margaret about my failures and shortcomings, and I'd gone to the church barbecue hoping to lose myself in the comfort of community. Richard had appeared at my table with a plate of perfectly grilled vegetables arranged like a work of art, and when I'd looked up into his kind eyes, something in my chest had loosened for the first time in years. "I was the new guy," Richard continued. "Just a chef trying to make a good impression at my first church event. But your mama smiled at me like I was exactly where I belonged." What Richard didn't mention, what Rose was too young to understand, was how that simple act of kindness had grown into the foundation of everything we'd built together. While my family measured worth by social connections and marriage prospects, Richard had seen something in me that I'd barely recognized in myself: strength, intelligence, and a capacity for love that had been dormant for too long. Later that night, after I'd tucked Rose into her bed surrounded by stuffed animals and picture books, I returned to my diary and wrote, "Rose is why I live authentically, and Richard is the man who chose me, not my family's country club status." My phone rang as I was closing the diary, and Richard's name appeared on the screen. "I wanted to hear your voice one more time before tomorrow," he said when I answered. "Are you nervous?" I asked, settling into my favorite armchair by the window. "About facing your family, no. About finally being able to claim you publicly as my wife. That makes me incredibly happy." He paused, and I could hear him moving around his hotel room. "You know, it's funny. I once met your mother at an old country club event years before I knew you. But that's ancient history. Don't think about it." I laughed softly. "Richard Alcott, are you telling me you have a romantic past with my mother?" "Hardly romantic," he chuckled. "More like professionally awkward, but that's a story for another day." The next morning, I held the VIP room ticket for the Ritz-Carlton in my hand, feeling its expensive weight between my fingers. On my laptop screen, Richard was adjusting his tie in preparation for his flight. "Tonight," I said, smiling at him through the camera, "we step into the light." The Ritz-Carlton Dallas rose before me like a monument to everything my family valued: prestige, exclusivity, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. I pulled my modest Honda Civic into the valet circle, watching as Bentleys and Mercedes disappeared into the capable hands of uniformed attendants who moved with the practiced efficiency of those accustomed to serving Dallas's elite. The lobby gleamed with Italian marble and crystal chandeliers, the kind of opulent setting where Sarah would feel perfectly at home, and I would be expected to fade into the background. I approached the reception desk with my small overnight bag, noting how the other guests moved through the space with the confident ease of people who belonged in such places. "Good afternoon," I said to the young receptionist, whose smile was professionally warm, but somehow managed to convey that she was already assessing my worth based on my appearance. "I'm Emily Hargrove. I believe there's a reservation for me." The woman's fingers moved across her keyboard with manicured precision, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly as she found my information. "Ms. Hargrove," she asked, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that made my stomach tighten. "Yes, I have you here. This room is per family request." She paused, glancing at her screen again before looking back at me with what might have been sympathy. "I should mention that there are no VIP amenities included with this particular accommodation." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I should have expected them. Of course, Margaret would have arranged for me to be treated as a second-class guest at my own sister's wedding. The receptionist handed me a key card with the same polite smile, but I could see in her eyes that she understood exactly what this room assignment meant. I was family, but barely. The elevator ride to the third floor felt interminable, and when I found my room, I understood why the receptionist had looked uncomfortable. It was clean and functional, but clearly designed for hotel staff rather than guests. The single window offered a view of the loading dock rather than the carefully manicured gardens that graced the luxury suites above. The message was unmistakable. I was here on sufferance, not welcome. I had just set my bag on the narrow bed when I heard the familiar click of expensive heels on marble flooring echoing from the lobby below. Through my small window, I could see Margaret making her grand entrance, resplendent in what was clearly a new silk dress from Nordstrom. The champagne-colored fabric caught the light as she moved, and even from this distance I could see the confidence in her posture, the way she commanded attention simply by existing in a space. 20 minutes later, as I made my way back down to the lobby, Margaret spotted me immediately. Her expression shifted from the gracious smile she'd been wearing for the other hotel guests to something much sharper and more critical. "Emily," she said, her voice carrying across the marble expanse with the kind of authority that made other conversations pause. "What are you wearing?" I looked down at my simple navy dress, one I'd chosen because it was appropriate and understated. It was a perfectly respectable outfit for a wedding, but under Margaret's scrutinizing gaze it felt suddenly inadequate. "It's so provincial," she continued, her voice loud enough that several nearby guests turned to look. "Like something from thrift stores in working-class neighborhoods. Please tell me you brought something more suitable for tonight. I will not have you embarrass Sarah at the country club." The familiar heat of shame crawled up my neck, but beneath it something else was building. I could feel the weight of every dismissal, every casual cruelty, every moment when I'd been made to feel less than worthy of basic respect. From across the lobby, I heard Sarah's distinctive laugh, bright and careless. She stood at the hotel bar surrounded by her bridesmaids, all of them dressed in coordinated pastels that screamed expensive taste and unlimited budgets. As I watched, she leaned toward one of her friends, her voice carrying just enough for me to catch her words. "She's trying on my old prom dress," Sarah was saying, gesturing in my direction with a martini glass. "At least it's vintage now, right? And it doesn't cost much, which is perfect for a single mother's budget." The group erupted in polite laughter, the kind of refined mockery that Dallas society had perfected over generations. Each giggle felt like a small knife, precise and deliberately placed to cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. I swallowed my anger, feeling it settle like a stone in my chest. Richard's words from our video call echoed in my mind. "They'll see who you are." Soon, I told myself. Very soon, the tables would turn in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. I excused myself from Margaret's continued critique and made my way back to my cramped room, my hands shaking slightly as I closed the door behind me. Pulling out my diary, I wrote quickly, "This humiliation is the final fuel. Every dismissal, every slight, every moment they've made me feel small has led to this. They have no idea what's coming." As I closed the diary, I turned to my suitcase and carefully opened it, pushing aside the blue prom dress that lay on top. Beneath it, wrapped in tissue paper like a precious secret, was the dress I would actually wear tonight. I lifted it carefully, watching as the brilliant red Chanel fabric caught the light streaming through my small window. The dress was a masterpiece of French couture, custom designed in Paris for my 5th wedding anniversary. Richard had surprised me with it during a weekend trip to France, insisting that I deserved to own something that reflected not just wealth, but artistry. The way it had been cut specifically for my body, the way the color brought out depths in my eyes that I'd never noticed before, the way wearing it made me feel like the woman I'd always been inside, but had never been allowed to show. I held the dress up to myself in the mirror, seeing not the family disappointment they expected, but the successful woman I'd become despite them. Tonight, their carefully constructed narrative about my life would crumble. "The stage is ready," I whispered to my reflection, and for the first time all day, my smile was genuine. An hour before the reception began, I made my way to the hotel's main ballroom to find my assigned seat still wearing the navy dress that had earned Margaret's disapproval. The Ritz-Carlton's event staff had transformed the space into something that belonged in a magazine, spread crystal chandeliers, cast warm light over tables draped in ivory silk. Centerpieces of white roses and peonies created elegant focal points, and everything gleamed with the kind of perfection that only unlimited budgets could achieve. Near the entrance, an easel displayed the seating chart in calligraphy so beautiful it was clearly the work of a professional artist. I approached it with the same sense of dread I'd carried to every family gathering for the past 20 years, already knowing that my placement would tell a story about my worth in the Hargrove hierarchy. I found the VIP tables first listed in prominent positions near the head table where Sarah and Mark would sit. Table 1 held Margaret's closest friends from the country club, Table 2 seated the Preston family patriarchs, and Table 3 was reserved for Sarah's college sorority sisters. I scanned the names methodically, looking for my own among the carefully curated guest list. My name was nowhere to be found on the first page. A young server in a crisp white uniform noticed me studying the chart and approached with the kind of helpful smile that hotel staff perfected. "Can I help you find your table, ma'am?" "I'm looking for Emily Hargrove," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The server's expression shifted subtly as she flipped to the second page of the seating chart, then the third. When she found my name, her professional composure faltered for just a moment. "Ms. Hargrove, you're at Table 12. Table 12 was listed at the bottom of the page, and when I followed her pointing finger toward the back of the ballroom, I understood why she'd looked uncomfortable. The table sat directly behind the kitchen doors, positioned where the servers would have easy access, but where the guests would be forgotten. It was the kind of placement reserved for distant acquaintances or +1s who couldn't be snubbed entirely, but didn't merit real consideration. "The Hargrove family requested this specific arrangement," the server said quietly, her voice carrying a note of sympathy that made my cheeks burn. "Are you distant relatives?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Even strangers could see that my placement at this wedding was deliberate, a message about my status within my own family. I managed to nod, not trusting my voice to remain steady. As guests began filtering into the ballroom for cocktail hour, I watched my family work the room with practiced ease. Margaret moved from group to group, like a seasoned politician, her champagne-colored dress catching the light as she introduced Sarah to Dallas society matrons and business leaders. Sarah herself was radiant in her reception dress, a second gown that was somehow even more stunning than her ceremony attire, and she accepted congratulations with the gracious smile of someone who had never doubted her right to be celebrated. I approached Sarah during a lull in her receiving line, hoping for some acknowledgement, some small gesture that might soften the humiliation of my table assignment. "Sarah," I said, touching her arm gently, "congratulations. You look absolutely beautiful." She turned toward me with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Emily, you made it." But when I opened my mouth to ask about the seating arrangement, to understand why I'd been relegated to the staff table, she was already looking past me to the next group of well-wishers, her attention moving on as if I'd never spoken. From across the room, I could hear Margaret's voice rising above the cocktail party chatter as she held court with a cluster of relatives I recognized from various family gatherings over the years. "Some people come to weddings just to count the free grilled shrimp," she was saying, her laugh sharp and knowing. "You know the type. They see an invitation as a meal ticket rather than a celebration." The comment wasn't directed at me specifically, but the timing felt too deliberate to be coincidental. Several of the relatives glanced in my direction, and I felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creep up my neck. Mark appeared at my elbow, then drink in hand, and already showing the effects of pre-reception champagne. At 35, Sarah's new husband carried himself with the confident swagger of a man who'd never questioned his place in the world. His family's banking connections had made him a catch in Margaret's eyes, and he seemed to relish his role as the golden son-in-law. "Emily," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the immediate area, "great to see you. Don't worry about where you're sitting tonight. Just grab a seat anywhere you're comfortable. It's all free, right?" He laughed at his own joke, apparently finding great humor in the idea that I might be concerned about wedding protocol. "Not everyone deserves the main table anyway. That's reserved for family and real friends." The casual cruelty of the comment hit me like a physical blow. Not everyone deserves the main table. The implication was clear. I didn't deserve consideration, respect, or even basic courtesy at my own sister's wedding. I made my way to table 12 and took my assigned seat, a strange calm settling over me as I sipped the Chardonnay that a server had placed at my place setting. The wine was excellent, probably chosen specifically to impress the VIP guests, who would never sit close enough to the kitchen to hear the constant clatter of dishes and hurried conversations between the catering staff. Around me, the reception was building to its crescendo. The jazz quartet played softly in the corner, couples began moving toward the dance floor, and the photographer captured candid moments of joy and celebration. But I sat in my corner like a forgotten prop, watching my family's performance from the wings. They thought I was the family member who could be safely ignored without consequence. They had no idea that Rose and Richard were on their way, that everything they believed about my life was about to be exposed as a carefully constructed lie. I pulled out my phone, discreetly typing a brief message with fingers that trembled slightly with anticipation rather than nervousness. "Bring her." As I hit send, a knowing smile spread across my lips, the sound of jazz music and distant laughter creating the perfect soundtrack for what was about to unfold. The dinner service had concluded, and the evening was moving into that relaxed phase where guests lingered over coffee and dessert, their conversations growing more animated as the wine continued to flow. I remained at table 12, observing the festivities like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture, noting the intricate social dynamics that governed every interaction in this rarefied world of Dallas high society. The jazz quartet had taken a brief intermission, leaving the ballroom filled with the comfortable murmur of satisfied guests, discussing business deals, upcoming charity galas, and the kind of gossip that sustained the country club circuit. Sarah moved gracefully between tables, accepting congratulations and posing for photographs with the practiced ease of someone born to this life. Her happiness seemed genuine, and despite everything, I found myself glad that she was having the wedding of her dreams. It was then that Margaret decided to make her speech. I watched her approach the small stage where the jazz quartet had been performing, her champagne-colored silk dress rustling, as she moved with the confidence of a woman accustomed to commanding attention. She took the microphone from its stand with familiar ease, having given countless speeches at country club fundraisers and charity luncheons over the years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret's voice rang out clearly across the ballroom, and conversations gradually died as all attention turned toward her. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment, I'd like to say a few words about my beautiful daughter, Sarah, and her wonderful new husband, Mark." The crowd settled into expectant silence, wine glasses held in manicured hands as Dallas society prepared to hear what Margaret Hargrove, former president of the most exclusive country club in the city, had to say about this union of two prominent families. "As a mother, there are few moments more precious than watching your child find their perfect match." Margaret continued, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone comfortable with public speaking. "Sarah has always been the kind of young woman who attracts the right sort of attention from the right sort of people. She understands what it means to build a life of substance and meaning." I felt my stomach tighten, sensing where this speech was heading. "Some people reach this age with no one by their side," Margaret said, her voice taking on a tone of gentle pity that made my blood run cold. "They go through life making poor choices, settling for less than they deserve, or simply failing to understand what it takes to build a proper relationship. Lucky for us, Sarah is different. She's found Mark, who comes from such a prestigious family, and together they represent everything we hope for in the next generation." The implication hung in the air like smoke, and I felt every eye in the ballroom turning toward my lonely table at the back of the room. Laughter began to ripple through the crowd, starting with nervous chuckles from those who understood the subtext, and building into something more robust as guests realized they were witnessing a masterful example of Southern passive aggression. "She's still single at 38. I heard one of Margaret's country club friends whisper to her table-mate, her voice carrying just far enough for me to catch the words. "How absolutely pitiful. Poor thing probably gave up hope years ago." Another voice joined in. "I always wondered what was wrong with her. Such a plain little thing compared to Sarah. No wonder she never found anyone suitable." Sarah applauded enthusiastically from the head table, her face glowing with pleasure at being the center of such positive attention. Mark stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and I watched him wink conspiratorially at a table full of his banking colleagues. "That's why Emily is always the odd one out at family barbecues." Mark said, his voice carrying across the immediate area with the confidence of someone who knew his audience would appreciate his wit. "Some people just don't understand how to play the game." The laughter grew louder, more pointed, and I felt the familiar sensation of being the unwitting entertainment at my own family's expense. Every slight I'd endured over the years, every casual cruelty disguised as concern, every moment when I'd been made to feel like a burden rather than a blessing, all crystallized in this moment of public humiliation. But instead of the crushing shame I might have felt in years past, something else was building in my chest. A sense of anticipation of power held in reserve of secrets about to be revealed that would transform every assumption these people had made about my life. I remained silent, lifting my wine glass to my lips with steady hands and taking a measured sip of the excellent Chardonnay. My eyes drifted toward the floor-to-ceiling glass doors that opened onto the hotel's terrace, where the lights of Dallas twinkled in the distance like earthbound stars. In the distance, so faint that it might have been my imagination, I could hear the first whisper of approaching engines. Margaret was still speaking, her voice building toward what was clearly intended to be an emotional crescendo about family values and the importance of making good choices in life. The audience hung on her every word, delighting in this perfectly orchestrated display of maternal pride and social positioning. My heart began to pound, not with anxiety, but with excitement. The sound was growing stronger now, a rhythmic thudding that seemed to match the beating in my chest. Other guests were beginning to notice it too, heads turning slightly as they tried to identify the source of the distant noise. "Marriage isn't just about love," Margaret was saying, oblivious to the growing distraction. "It's about building something lasting with someone who shares your values, your background, your understanding of what matters in life." The sound was unmistakable now, growing louder with each passing second. Several guests had turned their attention away from the speech, entirely craning their necks to peer out the windows toward the hotel's grounds. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Ritz-Carlton helicopter blades, thundered through the Dallas night sky. Wine glasses trembled on tables. The crystal chandeliers swayed gently overhead, and Margaret's speech faltered as the sound overwhelmed her amplified voice. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward the windows, watching in stunned fascination as landing lights pierced the darkness outside. The Sikorsky S-76 descended through the Dallas night like something from a movie, its powerful rotors creating a downdraft that sent napkins swirling across the hotel's manicured grounds and made the perfectly arranged floral displays on the terrace dance wildly in the artificial wind. Through the ballroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, 200 wedding guests pressed closer to the glass, their conversations forgotten as they watched the sleek aircraft settle onto the VIP helicopter pad that most of them had never known existed. Margaret recovered from her momentary speechlessness with the kind of dismissive laughter that had served her well throughout decades of country club politics. Still holding the microphone, her voice carried clearly across the now silent ballroom. "Well, that's certainly theatrical. Probably some hired actors from Hollywood trying to crash the party. I mean, really, who would bother coming to our wedding by helicopter? Some people will go to any lengths for attention." The guests around her tittered appreciatively, their initial amazement quickly transforming into the kind of sophisticated amusement that Dallas society used to distance itself from anything too earnest or dramatic. Several women near Margaret's table exchanged knowing glances, the sort of look that said they'd seen this kind of desperate showmanship before and weren't impressed. The helicopter's engines wound down with a high-pitched whine, and the sudden relative quiet made every sound in the ballroom seem amplified. I could hear the nervous laughter, the whispered speculations, the rustle of expensive fabric as guests shifted for better views of whatever performance was about to unfold on the hotel grounds. Then the aircraft door opened, and Richard stepped out. Even from this distance, he commanded attention in a way that had nothing to do with the dramatic nature of his arrival. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, his perfectly tailored suit unmarked by the helicopter ride, his dark hair barely disturbed by the rotor wash. In his arms he carried Rose, who looked like a fairy tale princess in a white dress that caught the landing lights and seemed to glow against the night. Sarah's champagne flute froze halfway to her lips, her eyes widening as recognition dawned. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of guest speculation. "Isn't that the guy from the church barbecue fellowship? The one who used to serve the food at those community dinners?" She turned to her bridesmaids, her expression shifting from confusion to something approaching disbelief. "He's playing a billionaire now. This is getting ridiculous." The bridesmaids giggled, delighted to be part of what they clearly saw as an unfolding drama. One of them, a blonde socialite whose father owned half of downtown Dallas, clapped her hands together. "Oh my God, Emily hired an actor? This is like something out of a soap opera." Mark's laughter boomed across the ballroom with the kind of masculine confidence that came from never having been truly surprised by life. He stood up from the head table, his dinner jacket impeccable, his smile wide with genuine amusement. "Emily, sweetheart," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the quiet room. "Hiring your old church chef to play the billionaire husband. That's commitment to the bit. I'll give you that. Very lifetime movie of you. Did you rent the helicopter by the hour?" His banking colleagues erupted in appreciative laughter, clearly enjoying what they saw as an elaborate joke at their own expense. Several of them raised their glasses in mock salute, as if toasting Emily's creativity in staging such an elaborate piece of dinner theater. But I was no longer listening to their commentary. I was watching Richard approach the hotel's main entrance, Rose chattering excitedly in his arms as they moved through the circle of light cast by the building's elegant exterior illumination. My heart was pounding not with nervousness, but with anticipation, with the knowledge that everything these people believed about my life was about to crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. I stood slowly, my chair scraping softly against the marble floor, and began walking toward the ballroom entrance. The guests nearest my table turned to watch, their expressions ranging from pity to curiosity to barely suppressed glee at being witnesses to what they assumed was about to be a spectacular social disaster. Margaret's voice followed me across the room. "Emily, dear, please don't make this worse than it already is. We understand you're feeling left out, but this kind of desperate attention-seeking really isn't appropriate for Sarah's special day." I reached the ballroom doors just as Richard and Rose entered the hotel lobby, and for a moment the three of us stood together in the marble expanse like actors taking their positions before the final act of a long-running play. Rose's face lit up when she saw me, her small arms reaching out with the uncomplicated joy that only children possess. "Mama!" she called out, her voice echoing in the grand space. I took her from Richard's arms, feeling her familiar weight settle against my hip, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo mixed with the lingering smell of helicopter fuel and night air. Richard's hand found the small of my back, a gesture so natural and protective that it spoke of years of practice, of countless moments when he'd offered exactly this kind of support. Around us, I could hear the wedding guests filing out of the ballroom, drawn by curiosity and the promise of witnessing whatever scene was about to unfold. Their whispered commentary created a soundtrack of assumptions and judgments, each voice adding to the chorus of people who thought they understood exactly what they were seeing. They were wrong, and that was going to be their biggest mistake. A senior hotel manager appeared, as if from nowhere, moving with the kind of urgent efficiency that suggested he'd been summoned by someone with considerable authority. He was an older gentleman with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades managing the needs of Dallas's elite, and as he approached our small group, something in his expression shifted from professional concern to what looked unmistakably like recognition. He stopped directly in front of Richard and executed a formal bow that seemed to come from genuine respect rather than mere professional courtesy. "Mr. Alcott," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the lobby. "We didn't know you'd be coming tonight. I do apologize for any inconvenience. Should I prepare the penthouse suite immediately?" He paused, his eyes taking in Rose and me with the same deferential attention. "And welcome to your hotel, sir. We're honored to have the owner of the Ritz chain with us this evening." The hotel manager's words fell across the marble lobby like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the crowd of wedding guests who had followed us out of the ballroom. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the distant hum of the elevator motors and the soft tick of the antique grandfather clock that stood sentinel near the concierge desk. "Mr. Richard Alcott built the Alcott Hospitality Group from nothing," the manager continued, his voice steady and professional, despite the obvious tension crackling through the air. "He started as a head chef 15 years ago and has since created one of the most successful luxury restaurant and hotel chains in the Southwest. We're deeply honored to serve you and your family tonight, sir." Margaret's champagne flute slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound like breaking crystal dreams. Her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and for the first time in my memory, my mother appeared to be at a complete loss for words. The confident society matron who had commanded this evening with such authority just moments before now stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Sarah's bridesmaids clustered around her like colorful birds, their earlier laughter dying in their throats as the implications of the manager's words began to sink in. Sarah herself had gone completely still, her bouquet trembling in her hands as she stared at Richard with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "But who are you really?" Mark stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. The banking executive, who had been so quick to mock what he assumed was dinner theater, now looked like a man who had just realized he might have made a catastrophic error in judgment. "I mean, this has to be some kind of mistake. You're the guy from the church barbecues, right? The one who grilled vegetables for the fellowship dinners." Around us, the murmur of recognition was beginning to build as guests pulled out their phones and began frantically searching for information. I could hear fragments of excited whispers, "Alcott Hospitality," and "That's the company that owns the Four Seasons downtown," and most tellingly, That name owns half of Dallas real estate. Richard's expression remained perfectly calm, but I could see something cold and calculating in his eyes as he looked at Mark. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Mark, I'm afraid I have some business to discuss with you," Richard said, his tone conversational but somehow final. "You're fired from your position at First National, effective immediately." Mark's face went from pale to flushed red in the space of a heartbeat. "You can't fire me. You don't even work at the bank. This is insane." "Actually, I can," Richard replied with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. Alcott Holdings acquired a controlling interest in First National 6 months ago. I've been reviewing the books, and your embezzlement of employee pension funds came to my attention last week. I don't tolerate people who lack basic character, especially those who steal from working families. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and I watched Mark's bluster crumble as the reality of his situation began to dawn on him. Several of his banking colleagues who had been enjoying the show just minutes before now stepped back as if moral compromise might be contagious. "That's impossible," Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're lying. This is all some elaborate prank." "The FBI will be in touch on Monday," Richard said simply. "I suggest you contact a good attorney." The crowd of wedding guests pressed closer, their earlier amusement replaced by the kind of morbid fascination that accompanied witnessing someone's public destruction. Margaret had finally found her voice, but it came out as little more than a whisper. "This can't be happening," she said, looking around wildly, as if searching for someone to explain how her perfectly orchestrated evening had descended into chaos. "Emily, what have you done? What is this?" I stood beside Richard Rose's small hand gripping mine tightly and felt a sense of calm descend over me that I hadn't experienced in years. All the humiliation, all the casual cruelty, all the moments when I'd been made to feel small and worthless had led to this moment. In my mind, I was already composing the diary entry I would write later. "Now they'll hear from me." The wedding photographer who had been capturing candid moments throughout the evening continued snapping pictures with the instinctive professionalism of someone who recognized historic moments when they occurred. The jazz quartet had emerged from the ballroom and stood near the entrance, their instruments forgotten as they watched the drama unfold. Rose tugged on my dress and looked up at me with the wide-eyed curiosity of a child who sensed that something important was happening but couldn't quite understand what it meant. "Mama? Why is everyone so quiet?" she asked in her clear, innocent voice. Before I could answer, the master of ceremonies appeared at the ballroom entrance, still holding his microphone and looking utterly bewildered by the turn of events. He approached our group hesitantly, clearly unsure of protocol when the evening's carefully planned schedule had been completely derailed. I reached out and gently took the microphone from his nerveless fingers, feeling its weight in my hand, like a weapon I had finally earned the right to wield. The crowd fell silent, 200 pairs of eyes focused on the woman they had dismissed, mocked and marginalized just minutes before. Margaret made a small sound of protest, but it died in her throat as she realized that the daughter she had spent a lifetime controlling was no longer under her power. Sarah's face was a mask of confusion and growing dread, as if she was beginning to understand that everything she thought she knew about her family was about to be revealed as an illusion. I looked out over the assembled guests, taking in their expensive clothes, their carefully maintained facades, their assumption that they understood how the world worked. They had spent the evening laughing at my expense, secure in their belief that they were witnessing the pathetic desperation of a woman who had never learned her place. They were about to discover how wrong they had been. "Now then," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the hotel's sound system, steady and strong for the first time in years. "You'll hear the truth from the beginning." The microphone felt warm in my hand as I looked out over the sea of faces, each one frozen in a tableau of shock and anticipation. These were people who had known me my entire life, yet they had never truly seen me. Tonight, that would change. 16 years ago, when I was 22 years old, I found myself pregnant. I began my voice steady, despite the tremor in my chest. I was terrified alone and completely unprepared for motherhood, but I was also filled with a joy I had never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I was going to create something beautiful, something that belonged entirely to me. Margaret's face had gone ashen, and I could see her hand pressed against her throat as if she was struggling to breathe. She knew what was coming, had probably dreaded this moment for years. My mother had different plans. I continued, letting my gaze sweep across the crowd before settling back on Margaret. She called me into the living room of our family home on a Tuesday afternoon in November. I remember the date because it was the day before Thanksgiving, and I had been planning to share the news with the family over dinner. Instead, I found myself sitting across from a woman who looked at my pregnancy like it was a disease that needed to be cured. The silence in the lobby was so complete that I could hear the soft whir of the hotel's ventilation system, the distant sound of traffic on the Dallas streets beyond the windows. Even Rose seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, standing quietly beside me, with her small hand clasped in mine. She said that the baby would ruin Sarah's future. I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. That Dallas society would whisper about the Hargrove family having an unwed mother, that it would damage our reputation at the country club, that Sarah would never be able to marry well with the shadow of my shame hanging over the family name. She gave me an ultimatum: terminate the pregnancy or leave the family forever. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd, and I saw several women press their hands to their mouths in horror. This was not the polite family drama they had expected. This was something raw and real and devastating. I chose to keep my child, I said simply. I chose love over fear, hope over reputation, and the possibility of joy over the certainty of regret. The memory of that night came flooding back with painful clarity. I had left my parents' house with nothing but a suitcase and my grandmother's jewelry, driving through a November thunderstorm with tears streaming down my face and no idea where I would go or how I would survive. I had ended up at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Dallas, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee growing cold, while I tried to figure out how to build a life from nothing. That night, I cried alone in my tiny apartment. I continued, the words coming easier now as the truth finally found its voice. I had no money, no job prospects, and no family to support me. I thought I had made the biggest mistake of my life. And then Richard appeared at my door with a warm meal and a promise that changed everything. I turned to look at Richard, who stood watching me with the same quiet strength he had shown that night 16 years ago when he had held me while I sobbed and promised that everything would be all right. He said, "Then let's start our own family right now." I recalled my voice softening with the memory. Not someday when we were ready or respectable or approved of by society. Right then, in that moment, with nothing but love and determination to sustain us. Margaret had begun to cry, silent tears streaming down her cheeks as she was forced to confront the consequences of choices she had made years ago. Sarah stood frozen beside her, her bouquet forgotten in her hands, as she stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I didn't lose a family that night, I said, my voice shaking but determined. I lost the right to call someone mother. I lost the illusion that blood relations automatically create love or loyalty or support. But I gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that real family is built on choice, not obligation. Rose squeezed my hand tighter, and I looked down at her beautiful face, seeing Richard's eyes and my own stubborn chin reflected in her features. She was living proof that the choice I had made in defiance of my mother's ultimatum had been the right one. "And here's the proof," I said gently, drawing Rose forward so the crowd could see her clearly. "Rose, our light. The child my mother wanted me to destroy because she was inconvenient, because she didn't fit into the carefully constructed narrative of Hargrove family respectability." The hall had gone completely silent, 200 people holding their breath as they witnessed something they had never expected Emily Hargrove. The family failure, revealing herself to be a woman of extraordinary courage and conviction. But I wasn't finished. There were deeper truths to be told, secrets that went back generations and touched the very foundation of everything the Hargrove name represented. That's just the surface of this story, I said, letting my gaze sweep across the crowd once more. Because recently I discovered something in my grandfather's private papers, something that reveals the true nature of the Hargrove inheritance. Something much darker than anyone in this room could imagine. Margaret's tears had stopped, replaced by a look of pure terror. She knew what I had found, what I had learned about the family's carefully hidden past. I turned to face her directly, no longer the cowering daughter who had accepted every criticism and cruel comment without resistance. I was a woman who had built a life of meaning and purpose despite every obstacle she had placed in my path. I left to protect my child, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the hotel's sound system. From you, the woman who once forced me to do to my sister what your mother did to you. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see Margaret's face crumble as the carefully constructed facade she had maintained for 16 years began to crack. But I wasn't finished. The truth demanded its full telling, and these people who had dismissed me for so long deserved to understand exactly what their silence and complicity had cost. Let me take you back to that Thanksgiving dinner, I said, my voice growing stronger as I drew from a well of pain I had kept sealed for too long. Picture the scene: our family dining room with the good china, the crystal glasses, the carefully arranged centerpiece that Margaret had spent hours perfecting. Sarah was 18 then, home from her first semester at Southern Methodist University, glowing with the confidence of someone whose future seemed limitless. I could see that Thanksgiving table as clearly as if I were standing in that room again, feeling the weight of my secret pressing against my ribs like a physical thing. The turkey had been perfectly carved, the conversation flowing around topics deemed suitable for family gatherings. Sarah's sorority activities, the upcoming country club Christmas gala gossip about neighbors and their children's accomplishments. I had been carrying my secret for 6 weeks. I continued watching Margaret's face grow paler with each word. 6 weeks of morning sickness hidden behind claims of having a stomach bug. 6 weeks of loose clothing and careful positioning to hide the changes in my body. 6 weeks of joy and terror warring in my chest as I tried to find the courage to share the news. The memory of that dinner table conversation came flooding back with painful clarity. I had been picking at my sweet potatoes, waiting for the right moment to make my announcement, when Margaret had launched into one of her familiar lectures about the importance of maintaining family reputation in Dallas society. Margaret was discussing the Henderson family scandal. I said, my eyes never leaving my mother's stricken face. Their eldest daughter had gotten pregnant at college, and Margaret was using it as a cautionary tale about the importance of making good choices. She said that one person's poor judgment could destroy an entire family's standing in the community. I remembered how my fork had trembled in my hand as Margaret spoke, how each word had felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of my hopes for acceptance and support. That's when I told them, I said simply. I put down my fork, looked around that table at the 3 people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and I said, I'm pregnant. The silence that had followed my announcement that night was nothing compared to the deathly quiet that now filled the Ritz-Carlton lobby. Every person in the crowd seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to hear how this story would unfold. My father dropped his carving knife. I continued the memory as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Sarah's eyes went wide with shock. And Margaret... I paused, looking directly at my mother. Margaret stood up so fast her chair fell over backward. I could still hear the crash of that chair hitting the hardwood floor, still see the way Margaret's face had transformed from shock to fury to cold calculation in the space of a few seconds. She didn't speak for a full minute, I said. She just stood there looking at me like I had announced I was carrying some kind of disease. And then, when she finally found her voice, she said the words that would change everything. Either you abort that baby, or you leave the Hargrove house. You cannot drag Sarah down with you. Margaret made a small, choking sound, and I saw her hand reach out towards Sarah as if seeking support. But Sarah had gone completely still, her bouquet forgotten in her hands, as she stared at me with growing horror. She explained it all very logically. I continued, my voice steady despite the tears I could feel threatening at the corners of my eyes. Dallas society would never accept an unwed mother in the Hargrove family. The country club members would whisper. Sarah's chances of making a good marriage would be compromised. The family's reputation built over 3 generations would be destroyed by my selfish decision to keep an illegitimate child. I remembered how reasonable Margaret had made it sound, how she had presented the ultimatum as if it were the only sensible choice, the only way to protect the family from scandal and shame. "I was given until morning to decide," I said. "Abort the baby and return to the family fold as if nothing had happened, or pack my things and never darken the Hargrove doorstep again." That night had been the longest of my life. I had sat on my childhood bed, surrounded by the remnants of a life I was about to leave behind, while rain lashed against the windows and the house creaked around me like a living thing in pain. "I chose to keep my child," I said, my voice growing stronger with the memory of that moment of courage. I called Richard from my bedroom phone at 2 a.m, crying so hard I could barely speak. And when I told him what had happened, when I explained that I was about to lose everything, he said the words that saved my life. "Then let's start our own family, one that isn't dependent on country club approval." I could still hear Richard's voice from that phone call, calm and sure, and filled with a love I had never experienced before. He had driven through the storm to reach me, arriving just as I was loading my car with the few possessions I could carry. "I left that house at dawn," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I drove through the worst rainstorm Dallas had seen in years, with everything I owned in the back of my Honda, and no idea where I was going or how I would survive. But for the first time in my life, I was no longer Margaret's daughter trying to live up to impossible expectations. I was Rose's mother, and that was enough." The transformation had been immediate and profound. As I drove away from the house where I had spent 22 years learning to be small and quiet and grateful for scraps of approval, I felt something shift inside my chest. The fear was still there, but it was accompanied by a fierce determination I had never experienced before. "That decision saved me," I said, looking out over the crowd of shocked faces. "And now, 16 years later, it saves the truth." That's when Sarah's composure finally shattered. Her bouquet fell to the marble floor with a soft whisper of silk and petals as she pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Sister, you're lying," she cried out, her voice breaking with anguish. "Mom would never do that. She would never force someone to... She turned to Margaret with desperate eyes searching for reassurance that would never come. "Right, Mom. Tell everyone Emily's making this up. Tell them you would never do something so horrible." Margaret's silence stretched across the marble lobby like a chasm, and in that moment Sarah's desperate plea for reassurance withered and died. I watched my sister's face crumble as she realized that her mother's lack of denial was confirmation enough of the horrible truth I had just revealed. But there were deeper truths to uncover, wounds that had festered for decades beneath the polished surface of our family's public image. Sarah had asked for honesty, and I was prepared to give it to her in full measure. "Since we're sharing family secrets tonight," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, "let me tell you about the other ways our mother shaped our relationship, Sarah. Do you remember senior year of high school when I was applying for academic scholarships to Yale and Harvard?" Sarah's eyes widened, and I could see recognition dawning in her expression. She knew exactly what I was referring to, and the guilt that flashed across her face told me everything I needed to know about her role in what had happened. I had worked for 4 years to build the perfect academic record. I continued, letting my gaze sweep across the crowd of wedding guests who were witnessing this family's complete destruction. Perfect SAT scores, valedictorian ranking, volunteer work, extracurricular activities. The admissions counselor told me I was a shoo-in for early admission to any Ivy League school. The memory of those scholarship applications came flooding back with painful clarity. I had spent weeks crafting each essay, perfecting every detail, dreaming of a future that would take me far from Dallas and the suffocating expectations of country club society. But somehow, mysteriously, my applications were never submitted. I said, watching Sarah's face grow paler with each word. The computer files were accidentally deleted, the hard copies disappeared from my room, and by the time I discovered what had happened, all the deadlines had passed. I remembered the devastation of that discovery, the way my guidance counselor had looked at me with pity and confusion when she realized my applications had vanished into thin air. I had suspected sabotage, but I had never been able to prove it. Margaret blamed me for the missing applications, I continued. She said it was just like me to be careless with something so important. And then she said something that I'll never forget. Because of you, Sarah didn't get into the Ivy League either. If you had been more responsible, maybe there would have been room for both of you. The twisted logic of that statement had haunted me for years. Somehow my failure to attend an elite university had been transformed into the reason for Sarah's rejection from her top-choice schools, as if there was only room for one Hargrove daughter to succeed academically. "Do you want to tell them, Sarah, or shall I?" I asked, looking directly at my sister. "About how you accidentally deleted those files while you were helping me organize my room. About how you threw away the hard copies while cleaning up." Sarah's bouquet lay forgotten at her feet, white roses scattered across the marble like fallen snow. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "But that wasn't the end of your jealousy, was it?" I continued, my voice growing harder as years of suppressed anger finally found their voice. "Let me share another memory with everyone. Our high school graduation party hosted right here at this very hotel. Do you remember what you said when you thought I couldn't hear you?" I could see Sarah's memory of that night written across her face like guilt made visible. She had been holding court with a group of her friends near the hotel bar, flush with the excitement of having been named prom queen and looking forward to her freshman year at SMU. "You told your friends Emily thinks she's so much better than everyone else with her perfect grades. But Mom will make sure she learns her place soon enough," I said, watching Sarah flinch as if I had struck her. "You were already planning my downfall even then, weren't you?" The wedding guests were completely silent now, transfixed by this public dissection of a family that had seemed so perfect on the surface. I could see phones being raised to record what was happening, but I no longer cared about the scandal this would create. "And let's not forget more recent history," I said, my voice carrying a note of bitter amusement. "Do you remember the church barbecue fellowship last summer, Sarah? When you saw Richard cooking for the community dinner and decided to try your luck with him?" Sarah's face flushed crimson, and she glanced around desperately as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "You spent the entire evening flirting with him," I continued relentlessly, complimenting his cooking, asking about his work, even suggesting that he should cater private parties for your friends. "You had no idea he was already married, did you? He was just another man you thought you could take from your plain older sister." The memory of watching Sarah work her charm on Richard still had the power to make my chest tight with fury. She had been so confident, so certain of her ability to attract any man she wanted, that she had never considered the possibility that Richard might already be taken. "He refused your advances," I said simply, "because he had already chosen me." But even as I spoke those words, I could see something breaking apart in Sarah's expression, a kind of desperate courage building in her eyes, as if she had decided that since all secrets were being revealed tonight, she might as well share her own. "Stop," Sarah said suddenly, her voice cutting through my recitation of her betrayals. "Just stop. You want to know about jealousy. You want to know about secrets." She looked around at the crowd of guests, at Margaret's stricken face, at the photographer who was still capturing every moment of this family's destruction. "I've known about Rose's existence for years," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Because I was also forced to abort a pregnancy, Emily. I was 19, and I made the choice you couldn't make. But here's what nobody knows: what Mom has spent my entire life hiding to keep the country club reputation clean." She turned to face Margaret with an expression of pure defiance, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized what she was about to reveal. "I'm not your real sister, Emily," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the marble lobby. "I'm Mother's illegitimate child with an old lover, someone she had an affair with while married to Dad. I'm the family secret that she's been covering up for 32 years. The confession hit the crowd like a physical blow, and I heard several gasps of shock from the wedding guests. But Sarah wasn't finished. "I was jealous because you have a real family," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "You have Richard, you have Rose, you have something genuine and beautiful. All I have is this performance, this lie that I'm the perfect Hargrove daughter when I'm really just Mom's biggest mistake." She bowed her head, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried through the silent lobby. "I just wanted Mother to be proud of me," she said. "But now I see that I was always the real outsider, and all my cruelty to you was just fear that someone would discover the truth." Sarah's face went pale as the full implications of her confession sank in, and she looked around at the crowd of guests who now knew her deepest secret. "Sister," she stammered, looking at me with desperate eyes. "You knew, didn't you? But why didn't you ever say anything? And now the whole hall knows I'm the real outsider." Sarah's confession hung in the air like a revelation that changed the very architecture of our family's foundation. The wedding guests stood frozen, processing the implications of what they had just heard, while Margaret looked as if she might collapse under the weight of secrets that were finally seeing daylight. But there was more to reveal, and I realized that Sarah's painful honesty had created an opening for me to explain the choices that had shaped the last 5 years of my life. The secret marriage that had protected my happiness while allowing my family to believe their comfortable narrative about my failures. "You want to know why I kept my marriage secret, Sarah?" I said, my voice gentler now as I looked at this woman who was my half-sister, someone who had carried her own burden of family lies for decades. "You want to understand why I let you all believe I was the spinster failure living alone in suburban obscurity?" I reached into my purse and withdrew the folded document I had carried with me tonight, knowing that this moment would eventually come. The marriage certificate was worn soft at the creases from being handled so many times over the years, but the official seal of Dallas County was still clearly visible. Margaret had already destroyed 2 serious relationships in my 20s. I continued unfolding the precious paper with careful hands. David Morrison, who worked at the law firm downtown. She called his parents and told them I was mentally unstable, that I had a history of depression, and would be a liability to their son's career prospects. The memory of losing David still stung even after all these years. He had been kind and intelligent, someone who had seen past my family's reputation to the woman I was trying to become. But Margaret's poison had worked its way into his parents' minds, and within weeks he had stopped calling. Then there was James Patterson from the accounting firm, I said, watching Margaret's face grow grayer with each revelation. She arranged to have him transferred to the Houston office, then spread rumors at the country club that I had been stalking him, making him uncomfortable with unwanted advances. James had never even said goodbye. One day he was there making plans for dinner and talking about introducing me to his sister, and the next day his office was empty and his phone number was disconnected. By the time I met Richard, I had learned to be afraid. I said, my voice thick with the memory of that fear. I was terrified that if Margaret discovered I was happy, she would find a way to destroy it, like she had destroyed everything else I had ever cared about. I remembered the agony of those early months with Richard, the constant anxiety that Margaret would somehow discover our relationship and poison it with her particular brand of social assassination. I had lived in terror of casual encounters at the grocery store or chance meetings at public events that might expose our growing love to my mother's destructive attention. When Richard proposed, I told him about my mother's history of sabotage. I continued, my voice growing stronger as I recalled his response to my fears. I explained how she had systematically destroyed my previous relationships, how she used the country club network like a weapon to isolate anyone who threatened her control over my life. Richard had listened to my fears with the kind of patient understanding that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. He had never dismissed my concerns as paranoia or overreaction, never suggested that I was exaggerating the threat Margaret posed to our happiness. "Do you know what he said?" I asked, looking around at the crowd of stunned wedding guests. "He said, 'Then we'll marry in secret, to protect you from the family shadows that have haunted you for too long. We'll go public when you're ready, when you feel strong enough to defend what we've built together." The wedding had been small and simple, held at the Dallas County Courthouse on a Thursday afternoon in spring. Richard had worn his best suit. I had carried a bouquet of daisies from the farmer's market, and our only witnesses had been a clerk and a janitor who had happened to be in the hallway when we emerged from the judge's chambers. "We were married 5 years ago," I said, holding up the certificate so everyone could see the official seal, the careful calligraphy of our names, the date that marked the beginning of our real life together. "May 15th, 2018. Here's the proof written in legal ink with the seal of Dallas County. Not a dream, not a fantasy, not some desperate charade to save face at a family wedding." The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not from nervousness, but from the emotion of finally being able to share this precious secret with the world. For 5 years, Richard and I had lived parallel lives, our real existence as husband and wife, and the performance we maintained for my family's benefit. We've been protecting this marriage like a treasure buried in hostile territory. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. Building our life together in secret while Margaret congratulated herself on my continued spinsterhood, while Sarah pitied me for my lonely existence, while relatives whispered about my failure to find a suitable husband. Richard stepped forward, then his presence as solid and reassuring as it had been for 5 years of hidden marriage. He placed his hand on my shoulder, a gesture so natural and protective that it spoke of countless moments when he had offered exactly this kind of support. "I've been proud to be Emily's husband every single day," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the marble lobby. "Proud of her strength, her intelligence, her capacity for building something beautiful despite every obstacle placed in her path. The only thing I regret is that she felt she had to hide our happiness to protect it." He turned to face the crowd of wedding guests, his businessman's confidence evident in every line of his posture. "We have a 4-year-old daughter who is the light of our lives," he continued. "We own a home filled with laughter and love. We've built a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. Emily has never been the family failure you all believed her to be. She's been the family success story, living authentically while the rest of you performed for social approval." Richard's arm slipped around my waist, and I felt the familiar comfort of his support as he drew me closer to his side. "And now," he said, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction, "the whole world will know what I've known for 6 years, that Emily Hargrove Alcott is extraordinary." The hall erupted in whispers and murmurs as the implications of Richard's words sank in. I could hear fragments of shocked conversation rippling through the crowd. "They've been married for 5 years, and with a child, and she's been Mrs. Alcott this entire time." The wedding guests were buzzing with the kind of excited energy that accompanied witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about in Dallas social circles for years to come. The excitement and whispers of the wedding guests created a backdrop of sound that seemed to amplify every heartbeat, every breath, as I stood in the center of this transformed evening with my marriage certificate still trembling in my hands. But as I looked down at Rose, who had been remarkably patient through all these adult revelations, I realized that the most important story was yet to be told. "Let me tell you about the moment that changed everything," I said, my voice softening as I knelt down to Rose's level, bringing the microphone closer so everyone could hear. 4 years and 3 months ago, at Presbyterian Hospital Dallas at 3:47 in the morning, I held my daughter for the first time. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. The sterile smell of the delivery room, the exhaustion that had settled into my bones after 18 hours of labor, the way the fluorescent lights had seemed too bright and too harsh for such a sacred moment. I had been terrified throughout my entire pregnancy. I continued, my hand gently smoothing Rose's dark curls as she leaned against my leg. Not of childbirth, not of the responsibility of motherhood, but of the choice I had made in defiance of my family's wishes. I had wondered countless times whether I was being selfish, whether I was destroying my child's future by bringing her into a world where she would be seen as a mistake. The nurses had placed Rose in my arms with the kind of efficient gentleness that spoke of years of experience with new mothers, but the moment her tiny fingers had wrapped around mine, everything else had faded into insignificance. The instant I looked into her eyes, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I knew I was right. Those perfect, innocent eyes were the future I had chosen, not the reputation my mother had tried to force me to preserve. In that moment, I understood that love isn't something you plan or schedule or approve of through committee. Love simply is, and it demands that you be brave enough to protect it. Rose giggled softly and whispered, "Tell them about the pictures, Mama." Her child's memory, somehow capturing the significance of something I had almost forgotten in the chaos of the evening's revelations. "She's right," I said, smiling down at my daughter before addressing the crowd again. For the first 2 years of Rose's life, I sent photographs to my mother through anonymous mail. No return address, no identifying information, just pictures of a beautiful little girl growing up without her grandmother's love. I remembered those carefully chosen photographs, Rose's first smile, her first steps, her first birthday party in our small but happy home. I had written brief notes on the back, "Your granddaughter at 6 months," or "Learning to walk," hoping against hope that maternal instinct might override social conditioning. Every single photograph was returned to me. I continued, my voice growing harder as I recalled the pain of opening those returned envelopes. Not thrown away, not ignored, but deliberately returned with the same note written in my mother's perfect penmanship, "Not my daughter." The cruelty of those 3 words had cut deeper than any of Margaret's previous rejections because they weren't just rejecting me anymore. They were rejecting an innocent child whose only crime was existing outside the boundaries of social acceptability. Margaret had been standing frozen throughout my recitation, but now I could see her beginning to tremble as she watched Rose play with a small toy she had pulled from my purse. The child was completely absorbed in her game, creating an elaborate story involving a tiny plastic horse and an imaginary kingdom, her bright voice providing a counterpoint to the heavy adult drama unfolding around her. "That child," Margaret whispered, her voice so quiet I almost missed it over the murmur of guest conversations. "That child has my daughter's eyes." The recognition in her voice was unmistakable, and I realized that despite all her efforts to maintain distance, despite all her returned photographs and deliberate rejections, Margaret had been studying those images carefully enough to see the family resemblance that connected Rose to generations of Hargrove women. "She has Richard's chin and my stubborn streak," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the hotel lobby. "But yes, she has the Hargrove eyes, the same eyes that looked back at me from the mirror when I was her age, the same eyes that have carried the dreams and disappointments of 4 generations of women in this family." I stood up slowly, bringing the microphone with me as I prepared to deliver the message that had been building in my heart for years. "I chose my daughter," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, "because no one chose for my mother years ago. Because I refuse to perpetuate a cycle of women sacrificing their children to social expectations, women denying their maternal instincts to preserve their standing in a community that would judge them for loving unconditionally." The feminist message resonated through the crowd, and I could see several women in the audience nodding with recognition. These were women who had lived through their own versions of impossible choices, who understood the weight of family expectations and social pressure that could crush a woman's spirit if she let it. Margaret was raised to believe that a woman's worth was measured by her ability to maintain appearances. I continued my gaze, finding my mother's stricken face across the marble expanse. She was taught that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned through performance, that maternal bonds could be severed if they became socially inconvenient. I could see the truth of those words written in Margaret's expression, the recognition of her own upbringing in an era when women had even fewer choices than they did now. "But I chose differently," I said, my voice ringing with quiet triumph. "I chose to love my daughter before she was born, to protect her from a family that would see her as a liability, to build a life where she would never have to earn her right to be cherished." Rose looked up at me, then her innocent face reflecting the love and security that had been her birthright from the moment of conception. She was living proof that it was possible to break generational cycles, to choose love over fear, to create something beautiful, despite every obstacle. I chose to be the mother I needed when I was her age, I concluded, my eyes never leaving Margaret's face. I chose to be the grandmother she deserves. Margaret's trembling had intensified, and now I could see tears beginning to stream down her cheeks as the full weight of what she had lost began to sink in. "That child," she whispered, her voice breaking with a grief that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "That beautiful child is Rose, my granddaughter." Margaret's acknowledgement of Rose as her granddaughter hung in the air like a bridge that might finally span the chasm between us. But I wasn't finished revealing the layers of deception that had shaped our family's carefully constructed narrative. The crowd of wedding guests pressed closer, sensing that more revelations were coming, their earlier amusement replaced by the kind of rapt attention reserved for watching someone's entire world crumble in real time. "You want to know about Power, Mother?" I said, my voice carrying a note of bitter irony as I looked at this woman who had spent decades diminishing my accomplishments while elevating her own social standing. "You want to understand why I've been content to let you all believe I was the family failure living in suburban obscurity." I reached into my purse again, this time withdrawing a manila folder that contained documents I had never intended to share publicly. But tonight had become a reckoning, and some truths demanded their moment in the light. 3 years ago, you were facing foreclosure on the family home, I said, watching Margaret's face go pale as she realized where this revelation was heading. "Do you remember how desperate you were? How you called everyone you knew trying to secure a loan that would save the house that had been in the Hargrove family for 60 years? The memory of those frantic phone calls was still vivid. Margaret had contacted every bank in Dallas, every wealthy family in her social circle, every connection she had cultivated through decades of country club networking. But the financial crisis had been real, and the debts had been substantial. "You thought Sarah had found an angel investor?" I continued, my voice growing stronger as I prepared to expose the final lie. "Some mysterious benefactor who was willing to provide a substantial loan with incredibly generous terms. Sarah signed the papers, accepted the credit, and you praised her for finally stepping up to save the family legacy." I opened the folder and withdrew a stack of loan documents, each one bearing Sarah's signature and the seal of a private investment firm that existed solely for the purpose of protecting my anonymity. "Sarah didn't find that investor, Mother," I said, holding up the papers so the crowd could see them. "I was the angel investor. I was the one who provided the $2.7 million loan that saved your house, your lifestyle, and your standing in Dallas society." The gasps from the wedding guests were audible this time, and I could see several people pulling out their phones to calculate exactly how much money I had just claimed to possess. Margaret looked as if she had been struck by lightning, her carefully composed expression cracking to reveal the shock and confusion beneath. "But that's impossible," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmur of guest speculation. "You live in that little house in the suburbs. You drive a Honda. You work as a freelance consultant." "I live in that house because I choose to," I replied, my voice carrying clearly through the hotel lobby. "I drive a Honda because I don't need material possessions to validate my worth. And yes, I work as a financial consultant, but not because I need the income. I work because I enjoy helping people build secure financial futures." The irony of the situation was not lost on me. For years, Margaret had used my modest lifestyle as evidence of my failure, never realizing that my choices reflected financial security rather than financial struggle. "While you were calling me a failure at your country club meetings," I continued, my voice taking on a harder edge, "while you were telling your friends that I lived in obscurity while Sarah shined, you were literally living off my success. From kitchen table to boardroom, every comfort you've enjoyed for the past 3 years has been purchased with money I earned." Margaret's legs seemed to give out beneath her, and she sank into one of the lobby's elegant chairs, as if the weight of this revelation was too much to bear standing. "But there's more," I said, my voice dropping to a more serious tone as I prepared to reveal the darkest secret of all. "Because when I started researching your financial situation 3 years ago, I discovered something that explained a lot about our family's history and your obsession with maintaining appearances. I withdrew the final document from my folder, this one much older and more fragile than the others. It was a photocopy of pages from my grandfather's private diary discovered in a safe deposit box that had been forgotten for decades. Grandfather Hargrove's diary tells quite a story, I said, watching Margaret's face go from pale to ashen as she recognized the familiar handwriting. The Hargrove family wealth, the foundation of everything you've built your identity on, came from black market land deals in the 1950s. Systematic fraud that cheated dozens of working-class families out of their property in what is now downtown Dallas. The hall fell completely silent, the weight of this revelation settling over the crowd like a toxic cloud. I could see several guests exchanging uncomfortable glances, wondering if they were somehow complicit in celebrating a family built on criminal activity. For the past 3 years, while you've been living in that house I saved, I've been quietly tracking down the descendants of grandfather's victims. I continued, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. I've been paying restitution from my own funds, trying to make amends for crimes committed decades before I was born. Every family I could find, every debt that could be calculated, every wrong that could be made right. The moral complexity of the situation was staggering. Margaret had built her entire identity around a family legacy that was founded on theft and fraud, while I had been spending my own money to clean up crimes I hadn't committed. The money you've been so proud of, the social standing you've used to justify your cruelty, the inheritance you've held over our heads like a blessing we needed to earn. I said, my voice rising with years of suppressed anger. All of it came from stealing land from families who trusted the wrong people. And I'm the one who's been making it right. Sarah had been standing frozen throughout this revelation, but now she stepped forward with an expression of dawning horror. Sister, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, you've been doing this since when? All this time, while we thought you were struggling, you were cleaning up our family's sins. She looked around at the crowd of guests, then back at me with something that might have been respect. And now this inheritance, this legacy we've all been so proud of, it destroys us all, doesn't it? Margaret finally found her voice, but it came out as little more than a broken whisper. She sat slumped in an elegant chair, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes red with unshed tears. You've known, she said, the words seeming to tear themselves from her throat. About the land deals, about the fraud, about everything grandfather did. You've known since when? Margaret's question about when I had discovered the truth hung in the air, but I wasn't ready to let her deflect attention from the larger picture that was finally coming into focus. This moment belonged to every woman who had ever been dismissed, every person who had been underestimated, every individual who had been told they weren't enough while secretly carrying the weight of everyone else's failures. You want to know when I discovered grandfather's crimes? I said, my voice gaining strength as I prepared to paint the full picture of their hypocrisy. Let me tell you about the real timeline, about how your laughter became the fire that forged everything I've accomplished. I looked out over the crowd of wedding guests, seeing faces that had witnessed decades of family gatherings where I had been the punchline, the cautionary tale, the source of pitying glances and whispered comments about my failures. From my senior prom to every Thanksgiving dinner, from graduation parties to Christmas celebrations, you all laughed because I had no one, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the marble lobby. I remember sitting at those holiday tables listening to the jokes about my single status, the comments about how I'd probably end up alone with cats, the suggestions that I lower my standards and settle for whoever would have me. The memories came flooding back with painful clarity. Uncle Robert's wife patting my arm condescendingly while asking if I'd given up on marriage entirely. Margaret's country club friends exchanging knowing glances when I arrived at events alone. Sarah's college friends giggling behind their hands about the spinster older sister who couldn't catch a man. At last year's 4th of July barbecue, I sat at the picnic table listening to Cousin Janet explain to her teenagers that I was what happened when women got too picky, too career-focused, too independent for their own good. I continued feeling the old anger transform into something more powerful. You used me as a cautionary tale, a living example of what happened to women who didn't understand their place in the social order. But those moments of humiliation had done something unexpected. Instead of breaking my spirit, they had crystallized my determination to prove them wrong, to build something so substantial and meaningful that their petty judgments would be revealed as the shallow observations they had always been. That laughter, that constant dismissal, that was the fire that forged me, I said, my voice rising with conviction. Every joke about my empty love life became fuel for building a relationship based on genuine partnership. Every comment about my professional failures became motivation to create financial independence that none of you could imagine. I remembered the nights when I had sat alone in my small apartment writing in my diary, while tears of frustration and determination dried on my cheeks. Those had been the moments when I had made the choices that would define the rest of my life, to value substance over appearance, to choose love over approval, to build something real, rather than something that looked impressive from the outside. I once believed your words. I admitted, my voice thick with emotion as I recalled those vulnerable moments. I cried alone with my diary, questioning my worth, wondering if maybe you were right about my failures and limitations. But I don't believe them anymore, and I haven't for a very long time. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, built through small victories and quiet triumphs that my family had never bothered to notice or acknowledge. You want to know the truth about my timeline? I said, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. I've been married since I was 33. I've been a mother since 34. I've been financially supporting this family since I was 35. I've been cleaning up grandfather's crimes since I was 36. And I've been building an empire of love, success, and genuine accomplishment while you've all been performing for an audience that doesn't actually care about any of you. The irony was breathtaking in its scope. While Margaret had been bragging to her country club friends about Sarah's accomplishments and lamenting my failures, I had been quietly accumulating the kind of success that made their social climbing look pathetic by comparison. You laughed because you thought I was single. I announced, my voice echoing through the high-ceilinged lobby with the force of years of suppressed truth. You mocked me because you believed I was alone, unsuccessful, living a small life in suburban obscurity. But while you were laughing, I was building my own empire. I gestured toward Richard and Rose, the tangible proof of everything I had accomplished, despite their efforts to diminish my worth. An empire built on love rather than manipulation, on genuine partnership rather than social positioning, on creating something beautiful rather than simply acquiring something impressive. I continued. And now that dark inheritance that has poisoned our family for generations has been cleansed not by you, not by Sarah, not by the country club connections you're so proud of, but by me. The hall's atmosphere was shifting palpably. The initial shock and amusement of the wedding guests giving way to something deeper and more respectful. I could see it in their faces, the recognition that they were witnessing not just a family drama, but a masterclass in quiet strength and long-term strategy. Every dollar of restitution I've paid, every victim I've located, every wrong I've made right, has been funded by the success you refuse to see. I said, my voice carrying the weight of moral authority that came from actually doing the work rather than simply talking about it. While you've been living in a house built on theft and fraud, I've been ensuring that the people grandfather cheated finally received justice. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had punctuated the evening's earlier revelations. This was the respectful silence of people who finally understood that they had been witness to something extraordinary. A woman who had transformed dismissal into determination, laughter into strength, and family legacy into personal responsibility. I could hear nothing but the soft sound of breathing, the whisper of expensive fabric, as guests shifted uncomfortably, the distant hum of the hotel's ventilation system. Even Rose had gone quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding its implications. It was then that Margaret's voice cut through the silence, barely audible, but carrying clearly in the hushed lobby. She remained slumped in her chair, but her eyes had taken on a cold glitter that I recognized from childhood, the look that preceded her most devastating attacks. "You think you've won?" she whispered, her voice carrying a threat that made my blood run cold despite everything I had just revealed. Margaret's threat hung in the air like a blade poised to fall, but I had said everything I needed to say. The truth had been spoken, the secrets had been revealed, and the careful architecture of lies that had supported our family's reputation for decades had finally crumbled under the weight of honesty. I placed the microphone gently on the hotel manager's desk, the small action feeling monumentally significant after everything that had transpired. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of expensive fabric as 200 wedding guests stood frozen in the aftermath of revelations that would reshape Dallas society gossip for years to come. Richard stepped forward with the kind of quiet authority that had built his business empire, his voice cutting through the stunned atmosphere with decisive clarity. "Tonight ends here," he announced, his words carrying the finality of someone accustomed to making executive decisions. "The truth has been spoken, and there's nothing more that needs to be said in front of an audience." The guests began to shift uncomfortably, realizing that they had witnessed something far more dramatic and consequential than they had bargained for when they'd accepted invitations to what they'd expected would be a traditional Dallas society wedding. I could see phones being discreetly tucked away, conversations being murmured behind manicured hands, and the kind of meaningful glances that preceded weeks of country club speculation. Margaret remained slumped in her chair, but I could see something calculating beginning to replace the shock in her expression. She leaned toward Sarah, who stood frozen beside her like a statue carved from wedding silk and shattered dreams. "Come here," Margaret whispered, her voice so low it was barely audible over the murmur of dispersing guests. Sarah bent down obediently, and I watched as Margaret's lips moved close to her ear. Even from across the lobby, I could see the intensity of whatever she was sharing, the way her words made Sarah's already pale face go completely white. "I was also forced to abort a child years ago," Margaret whispered, but her voice carried just far enough for me to catch the words. "Before your father, before any of this. You think I'll let Emily destroy everything I've built from that pain? You think I'll let this slide?" The revelation should have shocked me, should have added another layer of complexity to the already tangled web of family secrets we had been unraveling all evening. Instead, I felt a strange sense of completion, as if this final piece of information had locked the last element of understanding into place. Her secret only made me stronger. Every revelation about Margaret's past, every glimpse into the pain and choices that had shaped her into the woman who had tried to control and diminish me, only reinforced my conviction that I had chosen the right path. I had broken the cycle of women sacrificing their children to social expectations, and no amount of retaliation could change that fundamental victory. Rose yawned against my shoulder, her small body finally succumbing to the exhaustion that comes from staying up past bedtime in a room full of intense adult emotions she couldn't fully understand. The innocent sound was like a bell cutting through the toxic atmosphere, reminding everyone present that there was still purity and hope in the world, despite the ugliness that had been exposed. "I'm tired, Mama," she murmured, her voice muffled against my neck. "Can we go home now?" The simple request from my daughter crystallized everything I had been fighting for. Home wasn't the house where I'd grown up, wasn't the family that had rejected me, wasn't the social circle that had dismissed my worth. Home was wherever Richard and Rose and I were together, building something real and loving and honest. The wedding guests were beginning to file out of the lobby in small groups, their conversations hushed but animated, as they processed everything they had witnessed. I could see the photographer packing up his equipment with the shell-shocked expression of someone who had expected to capture a fairy tale wedding and had instead documented a family's complete implosion. The jazz quartet emerged from the ballroom where they had been waiting out the drama, their instruments cases in hand and their faces carefully neutral. Even the hotel staff had begun the subtle process of clearing away the remnants of what had been planned as a celebration, but had transformed into something else entirely. Margaret slowly pushed herself up from the chair, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the emotional devastation of the evening. When she looked at me, her eyes held a cold fury that I recognized from childhood, the look that had always preceded her most vicious attacks on my self-worth. But I was no longer the vulnerable child who had cowered under that gaze. I was a woman who had built her own life, created her own family, and cleaned up messes she hadn't made while being told she was the family failure. Margaret's anger could no longer touch the core of who I was. "You think this ends tonight?" Margaret said, her voice loud enough now for the remaining guests to hear clearly. The steel in her tone was unmistakable, sharp, and dangerous as a surgeon's blade. "You think you can humiliate me in front of Dallas society and walk away without consequences?" She straightened to her full height, and despite everything that had been revealed about her past and her secrets, she still carried herself with the imperious bearing of a woman who had never learned to accept defeat gracefully. "I'll show you what real humiliation looks like," she continued, her voice growing stronger and more threatening with each word. "Starting tomorrow morning, you'll discover what happens when you declare war on someone who actually knows how to fight." The promise hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire carrying the threat of destruction yet to come. But as I stood there holding my sleepy daughter with my husband beside me, and the truth finally spoken, I felt no fear of whatever Margaret might attempt. The war she was threatening had already been fought and won. She just didn't realize it yet. Margaret's threat proved to be more than empty words. By 10 o'clock the next morning, my phone was buzzing incessantly with notifications that made it clear she had launched her promised campaign of retaliation with the precision of a military strategist and the ruthlessness of someone who had nothing left to lose. The first salvo came through traditional media channels that Margaret had cultivated over decades of country club networking. The Dallas Morning News website featured a prominently placed story with the headline, "Local Wedding Disrupted by Family Member's Mental Health Crisis." The article, clearly based on Margaret's carefully crafted narrative, painted me as a woman suffering from delusional episodes who had fabricated an elaborate fantasy about secret marriages and hidden wealth to disrupt my sister's wedding out of jealousy and spite. Emily Hargrove, 38, longtime Dallas resident, allegedly interrupted her sister's wedding reception at the Ritz-Carlton with bizarre claims about being secretly married to a billionaire, the article read, quoting Margaret extensively. Family sources indicate that Ms. Hargrove has struggled with mental health issues for years, including episodes of fabrication and attention-seeking behavior that have caused significant distress to her relatives. The journalist had clearly been fed a steady diet of Margaret's interpretation of events, complete with unnamed sources who corroborated her version of my supposed psychological instability. There was no mention of Richard's actual identity, no verification of the marriage certificate. I had displayed no investigation into the claims I had made about the family's financial history. But Margaret's media campaign wasn't limited to traditional journalism. Within hours, my social media feeds were flooded with notifications as Sarah launched her own digital offensive with the kind of sophisticated social manipulation that her generation had perfected. Her Instagram story featured a series of videos showing her in her wedding dress, mascara streaking down her cheeks, as she recounted what she described as the most traumatic night of her life. "I can't believe my own sister would do this to me," she sobbed into her phone camera, her voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine anguish. "On what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, she created this horrible scene with lies and accusations that have destroyed my wedding and humiliated my new husband." The video had been carefully crafted to maximize sympathy, showing Sarah in her bridal finery surrounded by the ruins of what should have been her perfect day. She tagged dozens of her country club friends, sorority sisters, and Dallas socialites, ensuring that her version of events would spread rapidly through the networks that mattered most to our family's reputation. "Please pray for my family during this difficult time," she continued in a follow-up post. "Mental illness is a serious issue, and I hope my sister gets the help she desperately needs. But I won't let her destroy the people I love with her delusions." The comments section filled rapidly with expressions of sympathy and outrage on Sarah's behalf, creating a digital echo chamber that reinforced Margaret's narrative about my supposed psychological breakdown. Meanwhile, Mark had apparently recovered from his shock enough to launch his own counterattack through legal channels. My phone rang repeatedly with calls from reporters who had been contacted by his attorney, a prominent Dallas lawyer who specialized in corporate defamation cases. Mr. Preston maintains that he has been the victim of a malicious smear campaign, the lawyer had told the business press. He intends to pursue all available legal remedies against Mr. Alcott for wrongful termination based on fabricated accusations of financial impropriety. My client's reputation has been severely damaged by these baseless claims. The legal threat was clearly designed to intimidate Richard into backing down from his accusations about Mark's embezzlement, but it also served the broader purpose of casting doubt on everything we had revealed the night before. I sat in our kitchen that morning scrolling through the rapidly expanding media coverage while Rose ate her cereal, and Richard made phone calls to his own legal team. The coordinated nature of the attack was impressive in its scope and timing, suggesting that Margaret had spent the sleepless hours after the wedding orchestrating a comprehensive campaign to destroy my credibility. "They're being thorough," Richard observed, ending his call with our attorney and settling into the chair beside me. 3 different angles of attack: mental health angle through traditional media, social sympathy campaign through digital platforms, and legal intimidation through Mark's defamation threats. The strategy was sophisticated enough to suggest professional assistance, and I wondered if Margaret had called in favors from the public relations firms that handled crisis management for Dallas's elite families. "They chose war," I said quietly, watching Rose's innocent contentment as she arranged her cereal into patterns in her bowl. "I gave them every opportunity to accept the truth gracefully, but they've decided to destroy me instead." Richard reached across the table and took my hand, his touch steady and reassuring despite the chaos swirling around us. "So we'll play by our rules," he said, his voice carrying the calm confidence that had built his business empire. "They're fighting this like it's a social media campaign, but we have actual evidence, actual documentation, actual legal standing." My phone buzzed with yet another notification, but this one was different from the stream of news alerts and social media mentions that had been flooding my device all morning. It was an email from an address I didn't recognize with a subject line that made my pulse quicken. "Urgent warning. Media escalation planned." I opened the message carefully, my eyes scanning the brief text that contained information someone clearly felt I needed to know immediately. "Ms. Alcott." The anonymous email read, "I work for a media relations firm that has been contacted about your family situation. I cannot reveal my identity for professional reasons, but I felt you should know that they're planning to take this national. CNN and Fox News have both been pitched stories about your breakdown, and there's talk of a coordinated campaign across multiple platforms. This won't stay local much longer. Be ready and know that there are people who witnessed what really happened. I have evidence that might help when the time comes." I showed the message to Richard, watching his expression grow more serious as he read the warning about national media attention. "It seems Margaret isn't content with destroying me locally," I said, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of what we were facing. "She wants to make this a national story about mental illness and family dysfunction." Richard nodded grimly, his businessman's mind already calculating the implications of expanded media coverage. "Then we'd better be ready," he said, reaching for his own phone. "Because if they want to fight this war in public, we'll give them a war they'll never forget." The anonymous warning proved prophetic within 48 hours. Margaret's media offensive escalated from local Dallas coverage to national tabloid attention with the kind of speed that suggested professional coordination and substantial financial backing. People.com ran the story with a headline that made my stomach clench. "Dallas Wedding Disaster Sisters Mental Health Crisis Ruins Society Celebration." The article featured photographs that Margaret must have provided from our family archives, including that humiliating prom picture where I stood awkwardly beside a radiant teenage Sarah, looking every inch the plain older sister who would never measure up. The accompanying text painted me as a woman whose mental health had deteriorated over years of romantic failures and professional disappointments, culminating in a delusional episode where I had hired actors to play the role of my imaginary billionaire husband and child. The story quoted unnamed family sources who expressed concern about my increasingly erratic behavior and desperate attempts to gain attention through fabricated stories. What made the coverage particularly devastating was how plausible Margaret had made it sound. She had provided just enough real details about my past struggles to create a foundation of credibility for her lies, weaving together legitimate concerns about my withdrawn behavior with fabricated evidence of psychological instability. The national exposure opened floodgates for other media outlets to pick up the story. Entertainment news shows began featuring segments about wedding disasters that included footage from the Ritz-Carlton lobby, though the hotel's security cameras had only captured fragments of the evening's events. Social media influencers started posting reaction videos analyzing my behavior for signs of mental illness and debating whether I was a victim deserving sympathy or a manipulator seeking attention. Sarah's media appearances became increasingly sophisticated as she gained confidence in her role as the wronged sister. Her interview on KDFW's morning talk show was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, complete with carefully timed tears and a narrative that painted our relationship as a lifelong pattern of my jealousy and her patient suffering. "Emily has always struggled with feeling inferior," Sarah told the sympathetic host, dabbing at her eyes with tissues provided by the show's producers. "Even when we were children, she would create elaborate fantasies to explain why she wasn't as successful or popular as other people. I've tried to be supportive, but this wedding incident was the culmination of years of increasingly concerning behavior." The interview was shot in soft lighting that made Sarah look vulnerable and sympathetic, while the old family photographs they displayed on screen had been carefully selected to show me looking awkward, uncomfortable, or isolated at various family gatherings. "I think she genuinely believes her own stories now," Sarah continued, her voice breaking convincingly. "That's what makes this so heartbreaking. She's created this alternate reality where she's the successful one, where she's married to a billionaire, where she's the family hero instead of the person who needs help." The host nodded along sympathetically, asking leading questions that allowed Sarah to elaborate on her portrayal of me as a woman whose grip on reality had gradually loosened over years of disappointment and social rejection. Meanwhile, Mark's legal offensive was gaining momentum through channels that carried more serious consequences than tabloid coverage. His attorney had filed a comprehensive lawsuit against Richard's companies alleging wrongful termination, defamation, and corporate abuse of power. The legal documents, which had been leaked to business reporters, painted Richard as a vindictive billionaire who had used his corporate influence to destroy an innocent man's career based on personal animosity. Mr. Preston was terminated without cause and publicly humiliated based on fabricated accusations of financial impropriety, the lawsuit claimed. Mr. Alcott's actions represent a clear abuse of corporate power designed to silence someone who had witnessed his client's unstable behavior. The legal strategy was clever in its implications, suggesting that Richard's defense of me was evidence of his own poor judgment, and that any documentation we might provide about Mark's actual embezzlement was part of an elaborate cover-up designed to justify vengeful behavior. Through all of this media storm, I maintained my silence. Richard's attorneys had advised against any public statements until we could mount a comprehensive response, and I found myself grateful for the enforced quiet that allowed me to focus on gathering the evidence that would eventually vindicate us. I spent those days in my home office surrounded by boxes of documents and files that told the real story of our family's history. My digital diary, which I had maintained for over a decade, contained video entries that captured moments Margaret and Sarah had clearly forgotten or hoped would never surface. There was the recording from 3 years ago, where Sarah drunkenly confessed at a family barbecue that she had always been jealous of my academic achievements, bragging to her friends about how she had taken care of my college applications. There were multiple entries documenting Margaret's systematic sabotage of my previous relationships, including recorded phone conversations where she had openly discussed her strategies for driving away men she deemed unsuitable for the family image. Most importantly, there were financial records that documented every transaction related to the family home loan, every payment I had made to grandfather's victims, every piece of evidence that proved my claims about cleaning up the family's criminal legacy. Richard found me sorting through these files on the third morning of the media assault, his expression grim as he carried the day's newspapers into my office. "They've gone too far," he said, spreading the Dallas Morning News across my desk. The front page featured an above-the-fold story about our corporate vendetta against Mark, complete with photographs of his attorney holding a press conference outside the courthouse. "But there's something else," Richard continued, pulling out his phone with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and concern. "Sarah's video just leaked." He handed me the phone, and I found myself looking at a recording that must have been made during the wedding reception, probably by one of the guests who had been filming the evening's events for social media. But this wasn't footage of my speech or the dramatic revelations that had dominated the previous news coverage. This was Sarah, clearly intoxicated, standing in the hotel's bathroom with several of her bridesmaids speaking in the kind of unguarded way that people only did when they thought no one was recording. "You want to know the truth about Emily?" Sarah was saying, her voice slurred, but her words clearly audible. "She's not crazy. She's just finally fighting back, and Mother is terrified because Emily actually has the power to destroy us all." The leaked video began playing on Richard's phone, and I found myself staring at a scene that completely shattered every assumption I had made about my sister's motivations. Sarah stood in the Ritz-Carlton's marble bathroom, her wedding dress slightly disheveled, her makeup smeared from tears, surrounded by her bridesmaids who were clearly trying to comfort her. But instead of the self-pitying victim narrative she had been performing for the cameras this Sarah was speaking with, the kind of raw honesty that only emerged under extreme stress and alcohol. "You want to know the real truth about Emily," Sarah was saying, her voice thick with emotion and champagne. "I've known about her marriage for 2 years. I hired a private investigator because I was terrified that Mom would find out and destroy her like she's destroyed everything good that's ever happened to my sister." One of her bridesmaids, a blonde woman I recognized from various country club events, leaned closer with obvious concern. "Sarah, what are you talking about? You said Emily was delusional." "I lied," Sarah said simply, her words cutting through my chest like a physical blow. "I've been lying for years, playing the perfect daughter, the successful sister, the golden child, because someone had to keep Mom's attention focused anywhere except on Emily's actual life." The camera phone shook slightly, and whoever was filming, probably another guest who had stumbled upon this conversation, and realized they were witnessing something significant. "Every tantrum I've thrown, every crisis I've created, every single Sarah moment that's driven Mom crazy for the past decade, it was all to protect Emily," she continued, her voice growing stronger despite the tears streaming down her face. "Because someone had to keep Mom's attention on me, on my failures, on my drama, so she'd be too busy managing my chaos to notice that Emily was actually building something beautiful." My hands began to tremble as the implications of what she was saying sank in. All those years when I had resented Sarah's ability to command Margaret's attention, when I had felt invisible and forgotten while our mother fussed over Sarah's latest romantic drama or career setback, Sarah had been deliberately creating distractions to shield me from scrutiny. "I watched Mom destroy David Morrison," Sarah said, naming my college boyfriend whose relationship had ended so abruptly after Margaret's interference. "I watched her manipulate James Patterson's transfer to Houston. I watched her systematically sabotage every relationship Emily ever had, and I realized that the only way to protect her was to give Mom a bigger target." The bridesmaids were staring at Sarah with expressions of shock and confusion, clearly having never heard this version of our family dynamics. "So I became the problem child," Sarah continued, her voice breaking with exhaustion. "I created drama. I made poor choices. I gave Mom endless reasons to worry about me instead of focusing her destructive energy on Emily. Every time I saw Mom getting too interested in Emily's life, I'd have a crisis that demanded immediate attention. I thought back through years of family gatherings, remembering all the times Sarah had seemed to implode just when Margaret was beginning to ask too many questions about my activities or relationships. The pattern had been so consistent that I had attributed it to Sarah's need for constant attention, never realizing it might be strategic protection. "The irony is that Emily thinks I've been competing with her," Sarah said, laughing bitterly. "She has no idea that every success I've stolen from her, every moment of Mom's approval, I've hogged every time I've made her feel invisible. It was because invisible was the safest place for her to be." The video quality wavered as the person filming tried to get a better angle, but Sarah's voice remained clear and devastating. "And now she's strong enough to fight back," Sarah said, her voice filled with something that sounded like pride mixed with terror. "She doesn't need me to protect her anymore, but Mom is going to destroy us all trying to maintain control." One of the bridesmaids, a brunette I didn't recognize, spoke up hesitantly. "But Sarah, if you've been protecting her, why are you letting everyone think she's mentally ill? Why are you doing these interviews saying she's delusional?" Sarah's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the frightened little girl I remembered from our childhood. "Because I panicked," she whispered. When Emily finally stood up for herself at the wedding, when she revealed everything, I realized that Mom was going to come after her with everything she had. And my first instinct was still to protect her, even if it meant making myself look like the victim. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup further. "But there's something else," Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something I've never told anyone, not even Emily." The bathroom fell completely silent, and I found myself holding my breath as I waited for whatever revelation was coming next. When Emily was 22, after Mom gave her that ultimatum about the pregnancy, Emily tried to kill herself. Sarah said, the words falling like stones into still water. "I found her on the train tracks near our house at 2 a.m. She was just standing there waiting." The memory came rushing back with devastating clarity. I had blocked out most of that night the way trauma sometimes erases the moments when we come closest to the edge. But now I could see it, Sarah's face in the darkness, her voice calling my name, her hands pulling me back from a decision that would have ended everything. "I pulled her off those tracks," Sarah continued, her voice shaking with the weight of the secret she had carried for 16 years. "I held her while she cried, and I promised her that things would get better. But I never told Mom what happened because I was afraid she would use it against Emily, somehow would find a way to make her feel even worse about choosing to keep her baby." Sarah looked directly into the camera phone, as if she knew that this moment would eventually reach me. "That was how I've been making amends since childhood," she said. "For every cruel thing I did out of jealousy, for every moment when I let Mom use me as a weapon against Emily's confidence, for every time I failed to be the sister she deserved." The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at Richard's phone with tears streaming down my face, and my entire understanding of my family relationships turned upside down. I looked up at Richard, who was watching me with an expression of profound sympathy and understanding. "You sacrificed your entire reputation." I whispered the words, feeling inadequate to capture the magnitude of what Sarah had done. "All these years letting me think you were the golden child, letting me resent you for getting Mom's attention when you were actually—" I couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't find words for the complexity of love and sacrifice that Sarah's confession had revealed. Richard reached across the desk and took my hand, his touch grounding me in the present moment, even as my mind reeled with the implications of everything I had just learned. "She chose her sister," he said quietly, echoing the words that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Sarah's leaked confession had shattered my understanding of our family dynamics. But it was Margaret's response to that revelation that would prove to be the most devastating moment of this entire ordeal. Within hours of the bathroom video going viral on social media, Margaret appeared on a live television interview with WFAA Dallas, apparently believing she could control the narrative one final time. What happened instead was a complete psychological breakdown broadcast to the entire Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. The interview had been arranged as Margaret's opportunity to respond to Sarah's leaked confession, and she had clearly prepared talking points designed to maintain her position as the wronged mother, trying to protect her family from Emily's supposed mental illness. But when the host, Jennifer Martinez, asked her directly about Sarah's claims regarding the deliberate protection strategy, something fundamental cracked in Margaret's carefully constructed facade. "You want to know why I couldn't love Emily?" Margaret said, her voice rising to a pitch I had never heard before, sharp and desperate and filled with decades of suppressed pain. "Because every time I looked at her, I saw myself, smart, capable, deserving better than what I got, but too afraid to reach for it." The studio fell silent, and I could see the host's expression shift from professional curiosity to genuine concern as Margaret's composure began to disintegrate in real time. "I was 22 when I married Emily's father," Margaret continued, her hands shaking as she clutched the arms of her chair. "Not because I loved him, not because we had some great romance, but because he represented security. He had money, social position, the kind of stability that would protect me from ever having to depend on anyone else's charity again." The confession was pouring out of her now like water from a broken dam, years of carefully guarded secrets spilling across the television airwaves with no regard for the consequences. "I lived in those country clubs because I was terrified of being ordinary," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "Every luncheon, every charity gala, every social event where I smiled and played the perfect wife and mother, I was performing a role, because the alternative was admitting that I had never figured out who I actually was underneath all the expectations." Margaret's makeup was beginning to run as tears streamed down her cheeks, but she seemed oblivious to her appearance, lost in the grip of truths that had been festering inside her for decades. "I controlled Emily because I couldn't control my own life," she said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that held a kind of wild desperation. "Every time she showed independence, every time she demonstrated the courage I had never possessed, it was like looking into a mirror that reflected all my failures back at me." The host tried to interrupt clearly, recognizing that the interview had moved far beyond anything that should be broadcast live, but Margaret kept talking with the compulsive urgency of someone who had finally found the courage to speak truths that had been poisoning her for years. "Do you know what it's like to watch your daughter become everything you were too frightened to be?" Margaret asked, her voice rising again. "To see her make choices based on love instead of fear, to see her build a life of meaning instead of just social acceptability, to watch her be brave when you spent your entire existence being a coward." The raw honesty of her confession was devastating to witness even through the television screen. This wasn't the controlled, manipulative Margaret I had known my entire life. This was a woman whose psychological defenses had completely collapsed under the weight of decades of self-deception and suppressed guilt. "I hated her because she was everything I was too frightened to become," Margaret said, the words coming out like physical pain. "I hated her strength because it highlighted my weakness. I hated her independence because it exposed my dependence. I hated her authenticity because it revealed how fake my entire existence had been." She looked around the studio as if seeing it for the first time, her eyes wide and unfocused in a way that made me genuinely concerned for her mental state. "And Sarah," she whispered, her voice breaking completely. "My beautiful, manipulative, self-sacrificing Sarah, who learned to be just as fake as I was, but for better reasons. She became everything I taught her to be, except she used those skills to protect her sister instead of herself." Margaret doubled over in her chair, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from some deep well of grief she had never acknowledged before. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, her voice muffled by her tears. "I don't deserve it. I've spent 38 years punishing Emily for being brave enough to live the life I was too afraid to choose. I've destroyed relationships, sabotaged opportunities, and systematically undermined the confidence of the most capable person I've ever known." She looked up at the camera again, and for a moment I could see past the decades of cruelty and manipulation to something that might have been genuine remorse. "But I need her to know something," Margaret said, her voice growing steadier even as tears continued to flow. "I'm proud of her. I've always been proud of her. Every accomplishment I dismissed, every success I minimized, every moment of happiness I tried to destroy, it was because I was jealous of her courage and terrified of her strength." The studio had gone completely silent except for the sound of Margaret's ragged breathing and the distant hum of television equipment. "I was just too broken to say it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the microphones. "Too damaged by my own cowardice to admit that she had become everything I had dreamed of being but never had the courage to attempt." Margaret collapsed forward in her chair, her face in her hands, her entire body shaking with the force of finally releasing decades of accumulated guilt and self-hatred. "I've spent 38 years destroying the daughter I should have protected," she said, her voice muffled but still clearly audible. "And now it's too late to undo any of it." The camera remained focused on her broken figure for several more seconds before the host finally had the presence of mind to cut to commercial, but the damage was done. Margaret's complete psychological breakdown had been broadcast live to hundreds of thousands of viewers, creating a moment of raw human vulnerability that would be replayed and analyzed for weeks to come. Margaret's televised breakdown had left the entire Dallas media landscape in stunned silence. But it was Richard's reaction to watching that interview that would reveal the final missing piece of our family's complex puzzle. We sat together in our living room that evening, Rose finally asleep upstairs, the weight of the day's revelations settling around us like dust after an explosion. Richard had been unusually quiet throughout Margaret's broadcast, his jaw tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. When the interview ended and the news anchors began their shocked commentary about what they had just witnessed, he reached for the remote and turned off the television with deliberate finality. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice carrying a gravity that made my stomach clench with apprehension. "Something I should have shared years ago, but I was afraid it would change how you saw our relationship." I turned to face him fully, noting the way his hands were clasped tightly in his lap, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of secrets he had been carrying for too long. 15 years ago, I was working as a line cook for an upscale catering company that handled events at the Dallas Country Club. He began, his voice steady but distant, as if he was looking back through time to a version of himself I had never known. "I was 27, ambitious, working 3 jobs to pay for business school, dreaming of opening my own restaurant someday." The image of Richard as a struggling young chef was difficult to reconcile with the confident billionaire I had married. But I could see echoes of that determined young man in the way he still approached challenges with methodical precision. One evening we were catering a charity luncheon for the Garden Club ladies. He continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I was working the service station when I heard someone screaming at one of the teenage servers, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. She was crying, trying to apologize for some minor mistake with the place settings." I felt a chill of recognition, knowing exactly what kind of scene he was describing and who the likely perpetrator had been. "Your mother was berating this kid in front of everyone, calling her stupid and incompetent, saying she was exactly the kind of person who would never amount to anything because she couldn't even set a table properly," Richard said, his hands clenching into fists as he recalled the memory. "The girl was sobbing, and all these society ladies were just standing around watching like it was entertainment." I could picture the scene with devastating clarity, having witnessed Margaret's casual cruelty toward service workers countless times throughout my childhood. She had always believed that her social position gave her the right to treat people she considered beneath her with complete disregard for their dignity. "I couldn't stand it," Richard said simply. "I walked over and told your mother that she was being inappropriate, that the girl was doing her best and didn't deserve to be humiliated in front of a crowd. I suggested that if she had concerns about the service, she should speak to the catering manager privately." The confrontation he was describing must have been electric with tension, a young line cook challenging Margaret Hargrove in front of her peers at her own country club. Margaret looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. Richard continued, his voice growing quieter. "She asked me if I knew who she was, if I understood that she could have me fired with one phone call. When I told her that treating people with basic respect was more important than her social position, she made good on her threat. I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of pride in his courage and fury at Margaret's predictable response to being challenged by someone she considered socially inferior. "Within 2 hours, I was fired from the catering company," Richard said. But that wasn't enough for her. She made calls to every upscale restaurant in Dallas, every catering service, every hospitality business in her network. I was blacklisted from working anywhere that served her social circle. The systematic destruction of his career prospects was exactly the kind of calculated revenge Margaret excelled at using her social connections as weapons to punish anyone who dared to challenge her authority. I spent the next 2 years working in diners and fast food restaurants, taking any job I could find while I finished business school, Richard continued. I told myself that someday I'd show those people what someone like me could become, that I'd build something so successful they'd have to acknowledge that they were wrong about my worth. I could see the determination that had driven him to create his business empire the way Margaret's cruelty had become fuel for his ambition, in much the same way it had shaped my own quiet rebellion. When I met you at that church barbecue 6 years ago, I knew exactly who you were the moment you introduced yourself as Emily Hargrove, Richard said, looking directly into my eyes. For about 30 seconds, I thought about what an incredible coincidence it was, what a perfect opportunity for revenge it represented. The confession hit me like a physical blow, and I felt something cold and sharp twist in my chest at the thought that our entire relationship might have been built on a foundation of calculated vengeance. But then you smiled at me, Richard continued, his voice softening with the memory. And you asked if I was okay because I looked sad. You didn't know me from anyone didn't owe me anything, but you saw something in my expression and cared enough to ask about it. I remembered that moment with sudden clarity, the way Richard had seemed isolated and melancholy despite being surrounded by the cheerful chaos of the church barbecue. There had been something in his eyes that had called to the part of me that recognized loneliness and rejection. In that instant, all thoughts of revenge disappeared. Richard said, reaching across the space between us to take my hand. I realized that I had found someone who possessed the one quality your mother completely lacked: genuine kindness. You saw a stranger who looked troubled and reached out without any agenda except basic human compassion. His thumb traced gentle circles across my knuckles as he spoke, grounding us both in the present moment, while he shared the foundational story of our relationship. I fell in love with that kindness that night, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And over the next months, as I got to know you better, I realized that you were everything your mother wasn't: genuine, instead of performative gentle, instead of cruel strong, without needing to diminish others. The contrast he was drawing between Margaret and me felt both flattering and overwhelming, especially given everything we had learned about the complex motivations that had shaped our family dynamics. I married you because you had somehow survived being raised by that woman without becoming anything like her, Richard concluded. Because you had kept your capacity for love intact, despite years of being taught that affection was conditional and approval had to be earned. I sat in silence for several moments, processing the magnitude of what he had revealed. My husband had every right to hate my family, every justification for seeking revenge against the woman who had systematically destroyed his early career prospects. Instead, he had chosen to love her daughter. You chose love over revenge, I said, finally looking at him with new understanding and profound admiration, even when revenge was completely justified. Richard nodded, his expression serious but peaceful. Some battles aren't worth winning if they cost you your soul, he said simply. And besides, the best revenge against someone like your mother isn't destroying them. It's proving them wrong by building something beautiful despite their efforts to tear you down. Richard's revelation about choosing love over revenge had given me a new lens through which to understand the complexity of human motivations. But it was the cascade of consequences that followed Margaret's televised breakdown that would demonstrate how thoroughly our family's carefully constructed lies had poisoned everything they touched. The first domino fell within 24 hours of Margaret's live television confession. Sarah's lucrative endorsement contract with Estee Lauder, which had been the crown jewel of her influencer career, was terminated with a terse statement from the company's public relations department that left no room for interpretation. Estee Lauder has decided to end our partnership with Sarah Hargrove Preston, effective immediately. The statement read, "Recent developments regarding Ms. Preston's family situation and the associated media coverage do not align with our brand's commitment to family values and authentic representation." The corporate language was diplomatically neutral, but the underlying message was clear. Being associated with a family embroiled in scandal involving mental health manipulation, inheritance fraud, and systematic deception was too great a reputational risk for a luxury brand built on aspirational lifestyle marketing. Sarah's other sponsorship deals began falling away like dominoes after that. The jewelry company that had featured her in their spring campaign quietly removed her images from their website. The Dallas boutique that had made her their unofficial ambassador stopped returning her calls. Even the charity organizations that had previously courted her participation as a society figure suddenly found reasons to distance themselves from the Hargrove name. Margaret's destruction was even more swift and thorough. The leaked bathroom video had prompted several investigative journalists to dig deeper into her past, and what they found was a treasure trove of problematic statements and actions that had been overlooked or covered up during her years as a country club power broker. The Dallas Observer published a devastating exposé titled "The Real Margaret Hargrove: A Pattern of Discrimination," which detailed incidents going back decades where she had made racist comments about club staff, blocked membership applications from qualified minority families, and used her influence to maintain what she had privately called appropriate social standards. The most damaging revelation was a recorded phone conversation from 5 years earlier where Margaret had bragged to a friend about successfully preventing a prominent African-American surgeon and his wife from joining the country club using language that was both explicitly racist and strategically calculating. "We can't have those people changing the character of our membership," she had said, apparently unaware that the friend was recording their conversation during a bitter divorce proceeding. "There are ways to handle these situations without appearing discriminatory. You just have to be smarter about the reasons you give." The Dallas Country Club's board of directors held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to revoke Margaret's membership, citing violations of the club's stated values of inclusivity and respect. The expulsion was accompanied by a public statement expressing the board's commitment to creating a welcoming environment for all qualified members. More devastating than the official expulsion was the complete social ostracism that followed. The women who had been Margaret's closest friends for decades suddenly became unavailable for lunch dates, their assistants claiming scheduling conflicts that stretched indefinitely into the future. The charity committees she had chaired asked for her immediate resignation. Even her bridge club, which had been meeting at the same Dallas restaurant every Wednesday for 15 years, quietly moved their gathering to a different location without informing her of the change. Meanwhile, Mark's legal offensive against Richard had backfired spectacularly as federal investigators began examining the financial records that Richard's attorneys had provided as evidence of embezzlement. The FBI's white-collar crime unit discovered that Mark's theft of employee pension funds was just the tip of an iceberg that connected directly to the same black market land deals that had originally funded the Hargrove family fortune. Mr. Preston appears to have been using his position at First National to launder money through accounts connected to properties acquired through fraudulent means in the 1950s. Agent Patricia Williams told reporters during a press conference. This investigation has revealed a multi-generational pattern of financial crimes that extends far beyond simple embezzlement. The federal charges that followed included wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government, carrying potential sentences that would effectively end Mark's freedom for decades. His attorneys withdrew the defamation lawsuit against Richard, apparently recognizing that their client's legal problems had moved far beyond civil litigation. I watched all of this unfold from the safety of our home, holding Rose while she played with her toys and chattered about her day at preschool, blissfully unaware that her extended family was disintegrating in real time across every news platform in Dallas. They destroyed themselves. I told Richard one evening as we sat in our kitchen, the day's newspapers spread across the table like evidence in a criminal investigation. Every secret they tried to hide, every lie they told to maintain their reputation, every cruel thing they did to control the narrative, it all came back to destroy them. Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful as he scrolled through the latest news coverage on his tablet. Your grandfather's crimes, your mother's discrimination, Mark's embezzlement, even Sarah's manipulation of the media, it's all connected. One thread of dishonesty supporting another until the whole structure collapsed. The poetic justice of their situation wasn't lost on me. Margaret had spent decades using her social connections as weapons to destroy anyone who challenged her authority, only to find herself completely isolated when those same connections decided she was too toxic to associate with. Sarah had built a career on projecting an image of perfection and family values, only to lose everything when the truth about her family's dysfunction became public. Mark had tried to use his corporate position to intimidate Richard into silence, only to expose himself to federal prosecution in the process. The inheritance and secrets have come full circle, I murmured, watching Rose build an elaborate castle from her wooden blocks. Everything they tried to protect by hurting other people has been lost anyway. It was nearly midnight 3 days later when I heard the soft knocking at our front door. Richard and I had been watching the news coverage of Mark's arraignment, and we both looked up in surprise at the unexpected visitor. I opened the door to find Sarah standing on our porch, still wearing the same clothes she had been photographed in outside the federal courthouse earlier that day. Her makeup was gone, her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. "Sister," she said, her voice broken and desperate. "I destroyed my life trying to protect you, and now I've lost everything. The endorsement deals, the social media following, the respect I spent years building, it's all gone because of that bathroom video." She collapsed against the doorframe, her shoulders shaking with exhaustion and grief. "Now what?" she sobbed, looking at me with the desperate expression of someone who had reached the absolute bottom and had no idea how to climb back up. "What am I supposed to do now?" Sarah stood in my doorway, looking like a woman who had lost everything she thought defined her worth, and despite all the years of resentment I had carried, my first instinct was not triumph, but something closer to pity. I stepped back to let her into our home, watching as she took in the simple comfort of our living room with the kind of desperate attention of someone trying to understand how happiness was built from ordinary things. "Sit down," I said quietly, gesturing toward the couch where Rose's coloring books were scattered across the coffee table. "But before we talk about what happens next, you need to understand something fundamental about what's happened to your life." Sarah collapsed into the cushions with the boneless exhaustion of someone who had been running on adrenaline and desperation for days. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her carefully maintained appearance destroyed by the kind of stress that no amount of money or social connections could buffer. "No one destroyed you except yourself," I said, settling into the chair across from her with the measured calm that comes from finally understanding the full scope of a situation. "The jealousy that drove you to sabotage my college applications, the lies you told to protect what you thought was my reputation, the elaborate performance you created to manipulate media coverage. All of that came from choices you made, not circumstances that happened to you." Sarah's face crumpled, but I continued before she could interrupt with protests or justifications. "Even when you discovered you were the outsider, the illegitimate child Mother had been hiding to preserve her reputation, that didn't excuse the years of cruelty that came before that revelation," I said. "You chose to compete instead of connect, to diminish instead of support, to see my happiness as a threat to your security rather than something we could share." The words felt harsh, even as I spoke them, but they were necessary. Sarah had spent so many years deflecting responsibility for her actions that she had never been forced to confront the ways her choices had shaped the very outcomes she was now mourning. "But you were protecting me," Sarah said, her voice small and confused. The bathroom video, everything I said about keeping Mom's attention focused on me instead of you, that was real. Some of it was, I acknowledged. And I'm grateful for those moments when you chose to shield me instead of harm me. But protection born from guilt isn't the same thing as love, and manipulation disguised as sacrifice still causes damage to everyone involved. The conversation was interrupted by Rose wandering downstairs, her small feet pattering against the hardwood floor as she carried her favorite stuffed rabbit and looked around with the sleepy confusion of a child who had been awakened by unfamiliar voices. "Mama, who's the crying lady?" Rose asked with the direct honesty that only children possess, her innocent question cutting through the adult complexities of our discussion. "This is your Aunt Sarah," I said gently, lifting Rose onto my lap where she could feel secure while processing this new information. "She's sad because some difficult things have happened in our family." Rose studied Sarah with the unblinking curiosity of a 4-year-old taking in the tears and disheveled appearance with the kind of objective assessment that adults had lost the ability to make. "Why does Grandma hate Mommy?" Rose asked suddenly, apparently having absorbed more of the recent family drama than I had realized. The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding an explanation that could make sense to both a child and the adults who had created such a complicated situation. "Grandma doesn't hate Mommy," I said, carefully choosing words that would be truthful without being traumatizing. "She's learning to love herself first, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups get confused about how to show love when they're scared or hurt." Rose nodded with the easy acceptance of childhood, apparently satisfied with an explanation that acknowledged complexity without drowning her in details she wasn't ready to understand. My phone began ringing before I could continue the conversation with Sarah, and I saw Margaret's name on the screen with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. She had been calling sporadically since her televised breakdown, but I had been letting the calls go to voicemail, not ready to engage with whatever desperate manipulation she might attempt next. This time, however, something about the late hour and Sarah's presence in my living room made me answer. "Emily?" Margaret's voice was barely recognizable, thin and broken, in a way that immediately raised alarms. "You have to help me. I know I don't deserve it. I know I've forfeited any right to ask for anything, but I'm completely alone, and I don't know what else to do." The desperation in her voice was unlike anything I had ever heard from her before, lacking the calculated edge that had always accompanied her previous attempts at emotional manipulation. "The country club was everything to me," she continued, her words slurred in a way that suggested either medication or alcohol. "My entire identity, all my friendships, every structure I built my life around, it's all gone. And the inheritance, the family legacy I thought I was protecting by being so cruel to you, it was built on crimes I never wanted to acknowledge." I could hear her crying on the other end of the line, the sound raw and unguarded in a way that Margaret had never allowed herself to be vulnerable before. "I was wrong about everything," she whispered. "Wrong about what mattered, wrong about how to love, wrong about what would actually protect the people I cared about. And now I've lost my daughters, my granddaughter, my place in the world, everything that made me feel like I existed." The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with another incoming call. This one from a number I didn't recognize. I ignored it initially, but when it immediately called back, something about the persistence made me concerned. "Hold on, Mother," I said, putting her on hold to answer the unknown number. "Is this Emily Alcott?" a professional voice asked. "This is Dr. Martinez at Presbyterian Hospital. I'm calling about Margaret Hargrove, who was brought in by ambulance about an hour ago. You're listed as her emergency contact." The words hit me like cold water, immediately shifting my perspective from the emotional complexity of our family drama to the stark reality of medical crisis. "She's been hospitalized," I told Richard and Sarah, my voice quiet but urgent as the implications of the call sank in. Looking down at Rose, who had fallen asleep against my chest during the phone conversations, I felt the weight of decisions that would affect not just my own healing, but the kind of legacy I wanted to build for my daughter. The mirror that had been reflecting all of us throughout this ordeal was showing me something I hadn't expected to see, despite everything that had happened, Despite all the justified anger and years of accumulated hurt, I had already begun the process of forgiveness. The shadows of resentment were still there, but they no longer defined the landscape of my heart. My phone continued to ring insistently, the hospital calling back with information I would need to decide whether to receive. The hospital had kept Margaret for 3 days of observation, following what the doctors diplomatically termed an acute stress reaction. But what I recognized as the complete psychological collapse of a woman whose entire identity had been built on foundations of sand. When she finally called me from her hospital room, her voice carried a quality I had never heard before, genuine humility mixed with desperate hope. "Emily," she said, the words coming slowly as if she was testing each one before speaking. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you after everything I've done, but there's something I need more than I've ever needed anything in my life." I waited, holding the phone against my ear while watching Rose play in our backyard through the kitchen window, her laughter carrying on the warm Dallas breeze like a promise that joy could exist even in the midst of family chaos. "I want to meet Rose," Margaret continued, her voice breaking slightly on my daughter's name. "Just once. I promise no more lies about the inheritance or the past, no manipulation, no attempts to control or judge. I just want to see my granddaughter before it's too late to matter." The request hung between us like a bridge that could either connect us or collapse under the weight of decades of accumulated hurt. I found myself thinking about the woman who had raised me with such conditional love, comparing her to the broken person I had seen on television, confessing her failures to the entire Dallas metropolitan area. "There will be conditions," I said finally, my voice steady but not unkind. "No criticism of how Richard and I are raising her. No comparisons to how things were done in your generation. No attempts to undermine our authority as her parents. And absolutely no lies, no matter how small or well-intentioned." Margaret's relief was audible through the phone line. "Yes, of course, anything you think is appropriate. I just want to meet her honestly as the grandmother I should have been from the beginning." "And most importantly," I added, watching Rose chase a butterfly across the grass with the kind of unguarded delight that adults rarely experienced. "Just real love. If you can't offer that, if you can't see her as perfect exactly as she is, then this meeting won't happen." 3 days later, I found myself pushing Rose on the swings at Clyde Warren Park in downtown Dallas, the urban oasis providing a neutral territory where 3 generations of Hargrove women could attempt to bridge gaps that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Margaret sat on a nearby bench, her appearance dramatically changed from the imperious country club president I had known my entire life. She looked smaller somehow, wearing simple clothes instead of designer outfits, her hair styled more softly, her makeup minimal. The transformation wasn't just physical. There was something fundamentally different about the way she held herself, as if the collapse of her public persona had allowed a more authentic version of herself to emerge. Rose had been initially shy about meeting this stranger, who was supposedly her grandmother, hiding behind my legs and peeking out at Margaret with the cautious curiosity of a child who had learned to be careful about new adults. But as Margaret sat quietly on the bench, making no demands or attempts to force interaction, Rose's natural friendliness began to overcome her reservations. "Push me higher, Mama," Rose called out, her legs pumping as she tried to gain more momentum on the swing. The simple request broke something open in Margaret's expression, and I watched tears begin to stream down her cheeks as she witnessed her granddaughter's uncomplicated joy. "The child has your eyes," Margaret said quietly, her voice thick with emotion as she watched Rose soar back and forth against the backdrop of the Dallas skyline. "But she has her grandmother's smile. I can see it when she laughs, the same expression I used to see in the mirror when I was young and still believed in possibilities." Rose noticed Margaret crying, and with the direct concern that children possess, jumped off the swing while it was still moving and ran over to the bench. "Why are you sad?" Rose asked, her small face serious with the kind of empathy that hadn't yet been complicated by adult understanding of social boundaries. "Did you hurt yourself?" Margaret looked down at this small person who represented everything she had missed, Everything she had sacrificed in her pursuit of social acceptance and control, and I could see decades of regret crystallizing in her expression. "I'm not sad, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, her voice gentle in a way I had never heard her speak to me as a child. "I'm happy. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're happy, especially when they see something beautiful they thought they'd lost forever." Rose studied Margaret's face with the analytical intensity that 4-year-olds bring to understanding adult emotions, apparently deciding that this explanation made sense within her worldview. "Who are you?" Rose asked with characteristic directness, settling onto the bench beside Margaret with the easy intimacy that children could offer to strangers who felt safe. Margaret's breath caught, and she looked at me questioningly, clearly uncertain how to introduce herself to a granddaughter who had never known she existed. I nodded encouragingly, giving her permission to claim the relationship she had forfeited through her own choices. "I'm your grandmother," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm someone who's learning too late how to love the people who matter most." Rose accepted this information with the matter-of-fact adaptability of childhood, apparently adding, "grandmother who is learning," to her understanding of family structure, without any of the complexity that weighed on the adults around her. "Do you want to see me on the monkey bars?" Rose asked, already bouncing off the bench with the restless energy that defined her approach to life. "I can go all the way across without falling." Margaret watched Rose demonstrate her playground skills with the kind of rapt attention she had never given to my own childhood achievements, and I found myself seeing glimpses of the mother she might have been if fear hadn't shaped so many of her choices. As the afternoon wore on and Rose gradually warmed to this new grandmother figure, Margaret and I found ourselves sitting on the bench together while Rose played nearby, the first time in years we had shared space without the electric tension of conflict or manipulation. "She's remarkable," Margaret said quietly, watching Rose help a younger child reach the bottom rung of the monkey bars. "Confident, kind, completely secure in herself. You've given her everything I didn't know how to give you." The observation was both compliment and confession, an acknowledgement of the ways my parenting had succeeded where hers had failed. I felt something shifting in my chest, a loosening of anger I hadn't realized I was still carrying. Margaret turned to look at me directly, her eyes holding a vulnerability I had never seen before. "The child has your eyes, your strength, your capacity for joy," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she was trying to communicate. "Do I have a chance to make amends? Emily, is it too late for me to learn how to be the grandmother she deserves and the mother you needed?" Margaret's question about making amends had left me with more hope than I had felt in decades, but it was the letter that arrived 2 days later that would truly test my capacity for forgiveness and my willingness to rebuild relationships I had written off as irreparably damaged. The envelope bore Sarah's distinctive handwriting, but there was something different about it this time. Instead of the hurried scrawl she usually used for quick notes or social media captions, this was the careful penmanship she had learned in Catholic school, each letter formed with deliberate precision that suggested she had taken considerable time and thought with every word. I found myself hesitating before opening it, standing by my kitchen window, where the morning light streamed through the glass and illuminated the cream-colored stationery that spoke of serious intentions rather than casual communication. Rose was at preschool. Richard was at his downtown office, and I had the house to myself for what I sensed might be an emotionally challenging experience. The letter was 7 pages long, written on both sides of expensive paper that felt substantial between my fingers. Sarah's handwriting remained steady throughout, suggesting she had written it in one sitting, rather than returning to it multiple times, pouring out thoughts and confessions that had apparently been building pressure inside her for years. "Dear Emily," it began, and I could hear her voice in the formality of the greeting, the way she was trying to establish the gravity of what she was about to share. "I don't know if you'll read this entire letter, and I don't know if anything I say will matter after all the damage I've done, but I need to try to explain some things that I should have told you years ago." The first section dealt with our childhood and adolescent years, the period when the foundation of our relationship had been shaped by competition and comparison that I had always assumed was natural sibling rivalry. "I'm sorry for the jealousy that started so early and lasted so long." She wrote, her handwriting becoming slightly more emotional as she delved into specific memories. "From prom night, when I made you feel invisible to the Ivy League applications I sabotaged because I couldn't bear the thought of you succeeding where I had failed. I let Mom's poison turn us into enemies instead of allies. She was so skilled at making us compete for her approval that we never learned to support each other." Reading about the college applications from Sarah's perspective was particularly painful because she described in detail the internal struggle she had experienced while deleting my files, knowing she was destroying my dreams while telling herself it was necessary to protect her own fragile self-worth. "I told myself that if you didn't get into those schools, maybe there would be room for both of us to be successful in different ways," she wrote. "But the truth is that I was terrified you were smarter than me, more capable than me, and that everyone would realize I was the inferior sister if we were ever competing on equal terms." The middle section of the letter dealt with more recent events, including her flirtation with Richard at the church barbecue, which she described with a level of self-awareness that surprised me. "I flirted with Richard because I was afraid you were finally going to succeed more than me, and I couldn't stand the thought of you having something I didn't," she confessed. "It wasn't about wanting him specifically, it was about needing to prove that I could take anything away from you if I chose to. But now I see that I was already the real loser even before we knew I was the illegitimate child, because I had built my entire identity around diminishing someone I should have been celebrating." Her description of that evening was painfully honest, detailing how she had approached Richard with calculated charm, while simultaneously feeling disgusted with herself for behaving so destructively toward the sister she claimed to love. But it was the final section of the letter that completely shattered my emotional defenses and forced me to reconsider everything I thought I understood about the most crucial moment of my life. "There's something I've never told you about the night you decided to keep your baby." Sarah wrote, her handwriting becoming less controlled as she approached what was clearly the most difficult confession. "After Mom gave you that ultimatum after you left the house that night, I knew something was terribly wrong. I had seen the look in your eyes during dinner, the same look I had seen in Mom's eyes when she talked about her own mother's cruelty." My hands began to tremble as I read her description of following me that night, of watching me walk to the train tracks that ran behind our neighborhood, of realizing what I was contemplating in my despair and desperation. "I pulled you off those tracks at the last possible moment." She wrote, the words blurring as my eyes filled with tears. "You were standing there in your pajamas and coat, looking so broken and lost, and I knew that if I didn't act immediately, I would lose my sister forever. I held you while you cried, and I promised you that everything would work out, even though I had no idea how." The memory came flooding back with devastating clarity, the details I had suppressed or forgotten, returning like pieces of a puzzle, finally clicking into place. I remembered Sarah's arms around me, her voice telling me I was stronger than I knew, her promise to help me find a way forward that didn't involve surrendering to Margaret's ultimatum. "But I hid what happened because I was afraid Mom would know I had interfered with her plan to control your life," Sarah continued. "I was still so programmed to seek her approval that I couldn't risk her finding out I had chosen your happiness over her manipulation. That was how I had been making amends since childhood, in secret ways that protected you while keeping me safe from Mom's retaliation." I sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, the letter trembling in my hands, as I processed the magnitude of what Sarah had revealed. She hadn't just saved my life that night. She had kept it secret to protect both of us from Margaret's potential revenge, carrying the weight of that knowledge alone for 16 years. The letter concluded with a paragraph that was both apology and plea, written in handwriting that had become increasingly unsteady as Sarah's emotions overcame her attempt at controlled communication. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve another chance after all the ways I've failed as a sister," she wrote. "But I need you to know that saving your life that night was the best thing I ever did, even if I was too much of a coward to tell you about it." If my interference that night led to Rose's existence, to your marriage with Richard, to the beautiful life you've built despite all our family's toxicity, then maybe some good came from all the damage we did to each other. I folded the letter carefully, my vision blurred by tears that felt different from any I had cried during this entire ordeal. These weren't tears of anger or grief or frustration, but something closer to relief, mixed with a complex gratitude that I was still learning to understand. Standing by the window again, I looked out at the garden where Rose would play when she returned from school, thinking about how different our lives might have been if Sarah hadn't followed me that night, if she hadn't found the courage to pull me back from a decision that would have ended everything before it could begin. Words are easy, actions are hard, I said aloud to my empty kitchen, testing how the sentiment felt when spoken, rather than just thought. But saving a life changes everything. I reached for my diary, needing to capture this moment of transformation while it was still fresh and unprocessed by too much analysis. Maybe this time it's real. I wrote my handwriting reflecting the emotional turbulence of the day. Because Rose deserves an aunt, and we sisters don't have to be enemies anymore. I folded the letter again this time with a gentleness that felt like the beginning of something new, and found myself smiling for the first time in days. Maybe this time it's real, I whispered to the morning light streaming through my kitchen window. And I'll try, because that secret saved us both. Sarah's letter had opened a door I hadn't realized existed, and 3 weeks later I found myself extending an invitation that would have seemed impossible just a month before. The phone call to Margaret was brief and carefully worded, while my conversation with Sarah had been longer and more hesitant, both of us navigating the unfamiliar territory of tentative reconciliation. Sunday dinner at our house. I had said to each of them separately, not quite ready to coordinate a group conversation. Nothing fancy, just family time. Richard will handle the cooking, and Rose is excited to show off her latest art projects. The preparation for that dinner felt monumental in ways that had nothing to do with the actual logistics of hosting. Richard had planned a traditional Texas BBQ spread complete with brisket he'd been smoking since dawn, corn on the cob coleslaw, and all the comfortable foods that might ease the awkwardness of 3 women who were still learning how to be in the same room without weapons drawn. Margaret arrived first, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers that looked like she'd picked them herself rather than purchased them from an expensive florist. The gesture was so unlike her usual approach to social occasions that I found myself touched by the effort towards simplicity and authenticity. "These are beautiful," I said, accepting the flowers and noting how different she looked in casual clothes, her hair styled softly and her makeup minimal. "Rose will love helping me put them in water." Sarah appeared 15 minutes later, her own transformation equally striking. Gone were the designer clothes and perfectly styled appearance that had defined her public persona. Instead, she wore simple jeans and a cotton blouse, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look years younger and somehow more genuine. The initial tension was palpable as we gathered in our dining room, the space that had hosted countless comfortable family meals now charged with the electric awkwardness of people who weren't sure how to behave around each other. Margaret kept starting to speak, and then stopping herself, clearly struggling with the unfamiliar concept of conversation without agenda or manipulation. Sarah avoided making direct eye contact with anyone, her hands fidgeting with her napkin as if she needed something to do with the nervous energy. Richard carried in platters of perfectly smoked meat and grilled vegetables, his calm presence providing a stabilizing influence as he served everyone with the kind of gracious hospitality that had first attracted me to him at that church barbecue years ago. "This smells incredible," Margaret said, her voice carrying genuine appreciation rather than the performative politeness I had grown accustomed to. "I haven't had real barbecue in years." It was Rose who finally shattered the artificial politeness that was threatening to suffocate our attempts at connection. She had been observing the adult dynamics with the patient interest of a child who sensed something important was happening, and when she decided the grown-ups needed help, she approached the situation with characteristic directness. "Eat up, Grandma," she announced, climbing into the chair beside Margaret, with the easy familiarity they had developed during their park visits. "It's delicious," And Mommy's going to make chocolate cake later for dessert. She makes the best cake in the whole world." Margaret's face softened in a way I had never seen before, the genuine smile that spread across her features, transforming her entire appearance. "And Aunt Sarah," Rose continued, turning her attention to my sister with the inclusive enthusiasm that seemed to be her natural approach to family relationships. "Tell everyone the story about saving Mommy when she was sad. Daddy said it was very brave." The request hung in the air like a bridge between past and present. Sarah's face flushing as she realized that Rose had somehow absorbed the most important truth about our relationship, despite all the complexity surrounding it. "Well," Sarah said slowly, her voice gaining strength as she looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. "Sometimes, people need help when they're going through difficult times, and if you love someone, you do whatever you can to keep them safe." The simple explanation seemed to satisfy Rose, who nodded solemnly before returning her attention to her dinner, apparently having successfully facilitated the adult conversation she felt was necessary. After dinner, Rose disappeared into her art supplies and returned with a drawing she had been working on during quiet time at school. The picture showed 4 stick figures of varying heights standing in front of a house with the sun in the corner, and what appeared to be a dog that looked more like a purple horse. "This is us," Rose announced proudly, pointing to each figure in turn. "Mama, Daddy, Grandma, and Aunt Sarah. We're all together, and nobody is spare, because families need everyone, even the secrets." The innocent profundity of her statement made all 3 of us laugh simultaneously, the sound spontaneous and genuine in a way that seemed to release some of the tension that had been building throughout the meal. It was the first time I could remember laughing with both my mother and sister, without any undercurrent of competition or judgment. "Including the secrets," Margaret repeated softly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She's wise, this granddaughter of mine." As Richard began clearing the dishes and Rose settled into Margaret's lap to explain more details about her artwork, I found myself standing at the head of our dining room table with a wine glass in my hand, looking at this imperfect but hopeful gathering of people who were learning to choose love over habit. "I'd like to make a toast," I said, waiting until everyone had picked up their glasses, even Rose with her cup of milk. "To scars and the healing that comes after them. To the courage it takes to acknowledge damage and the grace required to move beyond it." Margaret nodded her hand, reaching across the table to briefly touch mine in a gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude. Sarah lifted her glass with hands that trembled slightly, her voice shaking with emotion as she prepared to make her own addition to the toast. "To new beginnings," she said, her eyes meeting mine with a combination of hope and fear. "And if my sister allows it this time, I promise I won't break the things that matter most." Sarah's promise to not break the important things this time had marked the beginning of a transformation that unfolded gradually over the following months, like watching a garden bloom after a long winter. The family dinners became a regular occurrence, each one less awkward than the last, as we learned to navigate conversations without the undercurrent of competition and manipulation that had defined our relationships for so long. 6 months after that first tentative dinner, I found myself walking Rose to her kindergarten classroom with a lightness in my step that I hadn't experienced since my own childhood. The morning routine that had once felt fraught with anxiety about judgment and social positioning now carried the simple joy of watching my daughter skip ahead of me, her backpack bouncing with each enthusiastic step. "Today, you're the star," I told her as we reached her classroom door, kneeling down to adjust her collar and smooth her curly hair. "Just like Mommy once dreamed of being, but now you get to shine free from all the dark inheritance that used to shadow our family." Rose beamed at me with the uncomplicated confidence of a child who had never doubted her worth or questioned her right to take up space in the world. She was living proof that cycles could be broken, that children could grow up feeling secure in their parents' love, without having to earn approval through performance or achievement. My phone buzzed with a text message as I walked back to my car, and I smiled when I saw it was from Sarah. The message contained a photo taken in my kitchen the previous weekend, showing Margaret and Rose standing side by side at the counter, both of them covered in flour, and grinning at the camera. Margaret held up a somewhat lopsided cake while Rose displayed her contribution a batch of cookies that were enthusiastically decorated but structurally questionable. "New family traditions," Sarah had written as the caption. "Grandma learning to bake with patience instead of perfection, and Aunt learning that forgiveness tastes sweeter than revenge." The image captured something I had never thought possible: Margaret genuinely enjoying the messy, imperfect process of teaching a child, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that came from connection rather than control. Rose looked completely at ease with her grandmother, their relationship built on the foundation of unconditional acceptance, rather than the conditional approval that had characterized Margaret's parenting. Later that week, I received a phone call that would provide an unexpected opportunity to share our family's story of transformation with a broader audience. Dr. Patricia Williams from the Dallas Women's Leadership Organization explained that they were organizing a conference focused on breaking generational cycles of family dysfunction, and they wanted me to deliver the keynote address. "We've been following your story through the media coverage," Dr. Williams said, her voice warm with genuine interest. "What you've accomplished in terms of redefining toxic family dynamics and creating space for healing while maintaining appropriate boundaries, it's exactly the kind of practical wisdom our audience needs to hear." The TED Talk invitation arrived 2 weeks later, a formal request to present on the topic of redefining toxic family from dark inheritance to bright legacy. The opportunity to transform our private healing into public service felt like the natural culmination of everything we had been through, a chance to help other families navigate similar challenges without the years of pain we had endured. As I began preparing my presentation, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. The woman who had stood silently in that Ritz-Carlton ballroom, absorbing humiliation and dismissal, felt like a different person entirely, from the one who was now preparing to speak about resilience and transformation to audiences across the country. The TED Talk itself took place on a crisp October morning in Austin before an audience of women from across Texas who had their own stories of family dysfunction and hard-won healing. As I stood on that red circle looking out at faces that reflected recognition and hope, I felt the weight of responsibility that came with sharing truth in service of others' growth. "It was never about revenge," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the theater as I reached the conclusion of my presentation. What looked like a dramatic confrontation at a family wedding was actually about reclaiming peace, demanding respect, and choosing love over the learned patterns of cruelty that had been passed down through generations of women who deserved better. The standing ovation that followed felt less like personal acclaim and more like collective recognition of the work that so many families were doing to heal from inherited trauma and create healthier legacies for their children. Driving home from Austin that evening, I called Richard to share how the presentation had been received. My voice still energized from the experience of connecting with other women who understood the complexity of loving people who had hurt you while still maintaining boundaries that protected your own well-being. The audience response was incredible. I told him, watching the Texas landscape roll past my window. There were tears, but also laughter, and so many people who came up afterward to share their own stories of family transformation. "I'm proud of you," Richard said, his voice warm with the kind of support that had anchored me through every challenge. "You've taken our private healing and turned it into something that can help other families avoid some of the pain we went through." When I arrived home that evening, I found Rose in the backyard with Margaret and Sarah, the three of them working together to plant a small garden in the corner where Richard had built raised beds earlier in the season. Rose was directing the operation with the enthusiastic authority of a child who believed her ideas were valuable, while Margaret and Sarah followed her instructions with the patient attention of adults who had learned to prioritize connection over control. Standing at the kitchen window watching 3 generations of women work together in the golden light of late afternoon, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond personal satisfaction. We had transformed a legacy of competition and cruelty into something that nurtured growth, and celebrated individual strengths without requiring anyone to diminish themselves for others' comfort. That night, after Rose was asleep and Richard was reading in his study, I stepped out onto our back porch and looked up at the Dallas sky, the city lights creating a gentle glow that softened the darkness. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of the flowers Margaret and Rose had planted together, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment of peace. "And now we fly higher than ever," I whispered to the wind that rustled through the leaves of our oak tree, free from the shadows of the past. Standing here today sharing my story with all of you, I never imagined that the worst night of my life would become the foundation for the best years I've ever known. That evening at Sarah's wedding, when I finally found the courage to speak my truth, wasn't just about exposing family secrets or claiming my rightful place. It was about choosing to live authentically for the first time in 38 years. I learned that silence isn't weakness when it's strategic, that love doesn't always look like forgiveness, and that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply refusing to let broken people break your spirit. Rose will grow up knowing she's unconditionally loved, something I had to learn to give myself as an adult. If my story resonates with your own struggles with toxic family dynamics or feeling invisible in your own life, I want you to know that transformation is possible. It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. What part of my journey spoke to you most? Was it finding the strength to set boundaries? Discovering unexpected allies in family members I'd written off? Or perhaps learning that healing doesn't require forgetting the past? Share your thoughts below, because your stories matter too. If this gave you hope or a new perspective on family relationships, please subscribe and stay connected. We all deserve to fly free from the shadows of our past.